Congratulations, you've time-traveled back to the Maya lowlands, and immediately, your lungs file a complaint. This isn't the cute, zip-line through the trees jungle of modern tourist brochures. No, you've landed in the real deal. Dense, dripping, soul-dampening rainforest, where everything is either trying to eat you, sting you, or steal your sandals. The air is 80% humidity and 20% mosquitoes. You're basically breathing soup. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. It's early morning, but already the sun is flexing its muscles, and the humidity has wrapped around you like a wet tortilla. You're surrounded by towering ceiba trees, considered sacred by the Maya, twisting vines, and 1,000 shades of green that make your last 5 houseplants look like pale amateurs. The jungle is alive, and not in a poetic circle of life kind of way. More like, you better not touch that leaf, or it'll bite back. The moment you inhale, you realize something's off. That thick air? It's not fog, it's the cumulative sweat of centuries, spiced with tree sap and the aggressive buzzing of bugs large enough to be legally classified as birds. You look around, no roads, no shops, and definitely no signal. Welcome to the Petén Basin, or Yucatan Peninsula, where the Maya built cities right in the middle of nature's most determined attempt to smother humanity. Now, let's set the historical stage. The ancient Maya didn't just survive here, they thrived. And that's not just impressive, it's basically magical. This isn't the open farmland of Europe, or the predictable Nile floodplains of Egypt. This is a karst landscape, full of porous limestone, which means no rivers on the surface in many places. Instead, the Maya had to dig reservoirs, create man-made ponds called aguadas, and even develop massive cistern systems called choltons to survive the dry season. You're already dehydrated, and you just realized your fancy stainless steel bottle is useless because it only holds coffee and despair. But the Maya were jungle engineers. In this steamy, swampy, bug-buzzing cauldron, they managed to build cities, yes, real ones, with plazas, pyramids, and stone causeways, sakbadop that connected distant settlements like ancient superhighways. These roads weren't just muddy trails either. They were whitewashed with limestone, reflecting moonlight for night travel. Meanwhile, you just tripped on a tree root and lost a sandal to a very determined toad. Now take a moment to look up. No, not at the howler monkeys throwing shade from above, but at the step pyramids rising through the canopy. These weren't built with bulldozers. The Maya quarried massive limestone blocks by hand, shaped them with stone tools, and carried them using nothing but manpower. No wheels, no beasts of burden, just caused feet, clever engineering, and probably a few curses in Yucatec. You shuffle forward, but every step feels like you're walking through wet laundry. Your shirt is now a sponge, your shoes are begging for mercy, and there's a tick in your sock contemplating real estate. You pass through a forest where ruins peek through the greenery, like forgotten gods, half swallowed by vines. These are not abandoned, not back then. They're bustling with life. Market stalls, farmers, stone carvers, priests, warriors, and scribes, all moving with a kind of purpose you haven't felt since you dropped your phone in the toilet. The Maya weren't just jungle dwellers, they were masters of environmental adaptation. In areas like Tikal and Calakmul, they cleared patches of jungle to grow maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers, aka the holy trinity of Maya cuisine. They even practiced terracing raised field agriculture, and used slash and burn techniques when necessary to manage their land. You're struggling to walk 50 feet without crying. They were feeding tens of thousands, and oh, the wildlife. That shriek you just heard, that wasn't a jaguar, that was a howler monkey. And yes, it does sound like the apocalypse is opening its jaws. The Maya didn't just live with the creatures of the jungle, they worshipped many of them. Jaguars were divine symbols of power and the underworld. Snakes were messengers of the gods. You're currently praying to the god of please let that not be venomous. By now, you're dizzy, itchy, and slightly hallucinating. The sweat has turned your clothes into a biohazard, and your modern survival skills are about as useful as a popsicle in the sun. Meanwhile, a group of Maya farmers walks past you with baskets of food on their heads, not even breaking a sweat. They give you a sympathetic look, like someone watching a toddler try to pay rent. And that's just hour one. You thought the jungle was the hard part. Oh no, friend, that was just the welcome mat. Next comes the language, the blood rituals, the death sports, and the astronomy-based apocalypse countdown. Better find some shade. You're gonna need it. Let's imagine something terrifying. You, parched and dripping from jungle humidity, stumble into a bustling Maya city. You spot someone who looks friendly, probably because they haven't yet drawn a weapon, and you attempt the international language of thirst. You point to your mouth and say, "Water? Congratulations. You've just invited yourself to a sacred naming ceremony, and might be contractually obligated to raise someone's firstborn now. Oh, and that parrot sitting on the noblewoman's shoulder, that's her spirit guide, and it thinks you're very forward. Welcome to Ancient Maya linguistics, where you're about to find out the hard way that Google Translate is 1,400 years too late, and charades can actually get you killed. Here's your first mistake, thinking the Maya spoke Mayan. That's like walking into Europe and asking everyone if they speak European. The Maya civilization wasn't a monolithic empire with one central language. It was a cultural patchwork quilt stitched together with at least 30+ unique languages, each with their own rules, pronunciations, and really creative ways to insult you. You might land in the southern highlands and hear Quiche, then travel north to hear Yucatec Maya, only to swing over to Tzotzil, Cucache, or Chol just a few days later. These weren't dialects. These were full-fledged, distinct languages with unique vocabularies and grammatical systems that would make your brain weep. The ancient Maya understood this complexity. That's why multilingual scribes and interpreters were essential in political centers. Meanwhile, you're over here, hoping someone speaks broken Spanish. Good luck with that. So maybe you're thinking, I can just read the signs. Bad news. Those aren't signs. That's Maya hieroglyphic script, and it makes Egyptian hieroglyphs look like a children's coloring book. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient world. It was a blend of logograms, symbols for words, and syllabic glyphs, symbols for sounds. To you it looks like a fever dream. Owls riding snakes, skulls with flowers for eyes, jaguars wearing jewelry, and dots everywhere. But to the Maya, it was language, math, poetry, and politics, all wrapped into one. You see a glyph that looks like a man vomiting stars, and assume it means danger. It actually says the sacred lineage of Kark, Tiliur, Chanchak shall not be questioned. Whoops! In Maya society, language wasn't just a tool, it was power. The elite class, especially the nobility and priesthood, guarded the written word like a family heirloom that could also summon rainstorms. Knowing how to read and write wasn't just about literacy, it was about legitimacy. Royal scribes wrote dynastic histories, astronomical tables, and prophecies carved into stone stelae or painted on bark paper books, codices, and they were revered for it. Imagine stumbling into a Maya palace and seeing a royal scribe painting a scene of war on a ceramic vase. You ask, "Where's the bathroom?" And he responds with a poem about your ancestors and your coming doom. This wasn't just small talk. This was high art and political propaganda in one stroke. Now, let's talk about daily communication. The Maya weren't walking around saying hello and how's your maize harvest. Language here was steeped in ritual and status. There were formal ways to address people depending on their class, gender, and relationship to you, which is a big problem because your default setting is awkward tourist. The priests had their own specialized ceremonial language used to conduct rituals and speak to the gods. If you thought ordering a taco in high school Spanish was stressful, try conducting a fire ceremony in a tongue that requires perfect intonation, or you accidentally summon the wrong deity. And trust us, some of them do not do forgiveness. Oh, and then there's the calendar language. The Maya tracked time using multiple interlocking calendars, each with its own system of naming days, months, and katuns, 20-year cycles. To record an event, you might hear something like, "It was 7 Arjar 13 Kayab in the 9th Baktun, the day the gods smiled upon the east." You were just trying to find out if it was Wednesday. Without language, you're not just isolated, you're suspicious. A stranger who can't communicate might be a spy, a demon, or just rude, and none of those end well. One misinterpreted gesture, and you might offend a noble, a priest, or worse, the daykeeper, the guy who literally decides which days are good for living. and which days are ripe for sacrifice. You try to explain you're a traveler. They think you're challenging the gods. You pantomime, eating corn. They think you're threatening to eat the maize god himself. Things spiral quickly. So here you are, in the middle of a city full of sharp obsidian, sacred bloodletting rituals, and deeply layered communication systems, trying to survive with nothing but a smile, and the worst mime routine since middle school talent night. You're linguistically lost, culturally adrift, and one weird vowel sound away from starring in someone else's origin myth. And guess what? You haven't even reached the ballgame yet. Your daily job? Wake up, farm corn, maybe cry a little, repeat. Sorry, your time-traveling high hopes have just been publicly sacrificed. You thought maybe you'd end up as a Maya priest, maybe a warrior with obsidian bling, or even one of those cool astronomer guys yelling about eclipses from a pyramid top. Nope, you've been firmly placed in society's favorite role, generic peasant number 4, professionally sunburned, spiritually exhausted, and agriculturally overworked. The elite tier? They're reclining in palaces, sipping cacao from ceramic cups covered in hieroglyphs. You're squinting at the same 3 rows of maize you planted last season, trying to decide whether that cloud on the horizon means much-needed rain or another week of swamp-scented misery. Let's get one thing straight. Maya society was not democratic, and you do not have a say. The civilization was structured like a stone pyramid, wide at the bottom with sweaty backs, and very pointy at the top with a smug king shouting instructions from the shade. At the very top sat the cool Ajar, the divine ruler, basically a walking PR campaign for the gods. Below him were the nobles, the king's relatives, priests, scribes and warlords, and below them were the artisans and merchants, clever folk who made things or traded jade and feathers and tried not to get involved in royal drama. And then, you, the farmers, the labourers, the walking Wi-Fi of calories for everyone above you. Also beneath, even you, the slaves, prisoners of war, criminals, or the deeply unlucky, they handled the dirty work of society, which sounds awful, until you realize your life as a free person is only marginally less miserable. It's dawn. The jungle fog still clings to the treetops, and your bones already hurt. You're up because the sun said so, and because your community depends on your crops, and because you have no choice. Your day begins with a quick meal of corn porridge, a toll, and maybe some beans, assuming last year's harvest wasn't ruined by drought, locusts, or divine wrath. Then it's time to grab your stone tools, hope your woven sandals hold out, and head to the milpa, the field where you'll perform the sacred daily act of bending over until your spine mutinies. You'll be planting, weeding, checking for pests, praying it doesn't rain too little or too much, and occasionally looking over your shoulder in case a jaguar or a noble shows up. You don't want to get eaten by either. Your crops are more than food, they are identity. Maize wasn't just the Maya's favorite carb, it was literally their origin story. According to the Popol Vuh, the gods made humans out of corn after failed attempts using mud and wood. Apparently, mud people were too floppy and wood people lacked souls. Tough crowd. So no pressure. But you're basically fulfilling your divine purpose by farming, and by divine purpose we mean ensuring your taxes, aka tribute in kind, get delivered to your local ruler in the form of food, cloth, or your own labor. You're not just farming for your family, you're feeding the priest who will later burn incense and decide if your village needs a bloodletting ceremony. Yay, teamwork. Maybe you're one of the lucky ones not tied to a field, but instead trained as an artisan, a weaver, potter, or stonemason. Better snacks, maybe, but don't get too comfy. If you're talented, your work goes to the nobles. If you're really talented, you get invited to the palace and asked to carve a monument, celebrating the noble who taxes your village the most. And while artisans were respected, they weren't protected. If you made a carving with a chipped nose on the king's portrait, hope you like voluntary unemployment and involuntary exile. You might ask, can't I rise in rank if I work hard? Oh, that's cute. Maya society wasn't into rags to riches stories. Your birth dictated your place. Nobles stayed noble, farmers stayed farming, and the only thing climbing upward was the smoke from your cook fire. The best you could hope for was local respect as an elder or a particularly reliable corn whisperer. Oh, and if you're male, once you hit adulthood, You're expected to participate in community construction projects, like hauling multi-ton limestone blocks with your friends to build temples you'll never be allowed to enter. It's like unpaid gym class, but with more sunstroke. You live in a small house made of wattle and daub with a thatched roof, and everyone, parents, siblings, cousins, probably a chicken or two, sleeps under the same roof. Personal space, unheard of. Bathing, you do it in rivers, with soap made from plants. Deodorant? What deodorant? Still, there are moments of joy, community feasts, songs sung under moonlight, ball games that you'll watch from the dust, more on that later, and the smell of tamales, steaming in banana leaves. You're tired, but not alone. You may be corn peasant number 4, but you're corn peasant number 4 in a complex, vibrant, alive civilization. Just don't expect vacation days. It's sunrise. The jungle mists are clearing. Birds chirp in eerie synchrony. Drums begin thumping in the distance, and smoke curls up from the top of the temple pyramid, like it's calling for backup from the spirit realm. Suddenly, someone grabs you and says, "The gods demand a gift." You smile politely and offer them your last piece of maize bread. They do not smile back, because today, you are the gift. Welcome to Maya religion, where the line between prayer and personal injury is paper thin, and your best hope for surviving the day is that someone else looks slightly more sacrificable than you. The Maya religion wasn't a casual, say grace and move on affair. It was a full-time cosmic negotiation with an entire squad of gods. There were deities for rain, sun, death, maize, childbirth, beekeeping, and probably losing your sandals in mud. At the top were heavy hitters like Chak, god of rain wielding lightning and bad moods. Itsamna, god of creation and writing, often depicted as a wise old man with cosmic responsibilities and possibly a caffeine addiction. Kuriel, god of royal power and abundance, known for having a smoking axe lodged in his forehead, as one does. But unlike some modern religions where the gods mostly mind their business, unless you're doing something outrageous, Maya deities were needy. They required attention. Specifically, they required blood. Human blood. Preferably yours. Before we jump to full-on human sacrifice, we will, don't worry. Let's talk about bloodletting, which was a DIY form of devotion. The idea was simple. Blood is life. And if you wanted the gods to notice you, you had to pay in red ink. But don't picture a minor paper cut and a whispered prayer. Imagine slicing your tongue, ears, or, for the truly devout, your genitals, and then letting the blood drip onto sacred paper, which would then be burned to send your soul's voicemail directly to the divine inbox. Elite rulers, especially kings and queens, regularly performed this as a ritual display of legitimacy. Carvings show queens threading barbed rope through their tongues like they're trying to sow their spiritual fate into the cosmos. Now imagine being at a ceremony where that's the warm-up act. And you're the foreigner who showed up smelling funny, asking weird questions, and interrupting the daykeeper's astrological math. Suspicious, exotic, probably cursed, perfect for something a bit more permanent. Human sacrifice wasn't an everyday errand, but when it happened, it was a major festival headliner. Important calendar dates, droughts, war victories, or coronations. Time to offer the gods something juicy. You didn't just ask Kiek to end a drought, you gave him something dramatic to prove you meant it. Enter you. There were several methods of sacrifice, and none were recommended. Heart extraction, the most iconic, performed atop a temple pyramid. The chest was cut open with an obsidian blade, and the still-beating heart was offered to the gods. It was messy, theatrical, and extremely final. Decapitation, especially linked to ballgame losers or winners. Maya logic is complicated. Your head could end up rolling down temple steps like the world's worst coconut, drowning. Some victims, particularly virgins or children, were tossed into sacred cenotes, natural sinkholes to appease deities like Chake. Fun bonus, people later dove into these cenotes and found thousands of bones and jewelry. And you were worried about dropping your phone. The Maya used multiple calendars simultaneously. The Tozok 260-day ritual calendar and the Hab 365-day solar calendar, interlocked like cosmic gears. Some days were lucky, others were doomed, and the priests, called Archean, were in charge of deciphering it all. If today's date aligned with drought, death, or anything that rhymed with oops, someone had to pay. you could be that someone. And if your zodiac sign in their world was a little too spicy, say born on 12 Kian, under a snake omen during a solar eclipse, well, congratulations, you've just been cosmically volunteered. Here's the plot twist for the Maya. Death wasn't necessarily tragic, it was a promotion, especially if you died in the right way. Falling in battle, dying in childbirth, or being sacrificed meant you might skip the underworld's worst tourist traps and head straight to the heavenly afterlife. They believed in Sibylba, the 9-layered underworld, filled with trickster gods and nightmarish puzzles, but sacrifice victims. They were considered honored, their spirits rising into realms of flowers and sky. So while you're screaming internally and externally, know that somewhere, a priest is reassuring the crowd, don't worry, they're going to a better place, which is objectively true, you just won't be around to enjoy it. So yes, your ancient horoscope predicted a spiritual awakening, but it left out the part where your blood gets painted onto a temple wall. Your name becomes a glyph meaning guest number 143, and your final thoughts are about how you really should have stayed in the cornfield. Now let's say you've been invited to the grand arena. Exciting, right? There's music, people shouting, incense smoke curling through the jungle air, and a crowd that smells like sweat and ceremonial anxiety. You assume you're here to spectate. Bad news, you've been drafted. Welcome to Pok, the ancient Maya ballgame, a blend of athleticism, religion, politics, and just a hint of lethal drama. It's the only sport where scoring a goal might win you glory, or a first-class one-way ticket to the underworld. You step into the court, a long, narrow stone alley, flanked by towering walls. On either side are vertical stone rings about 20 feet up, looking like basketball hoops had a baby with a medieval torture device. The court is hard, hot, and surrounded by crowds yelling in a language you don't understand but instinctively know. Includes the word pain. This isn't a backyard game. This is sacred ritual sport, played in the heart of the city, in courts that echoed beneath towering temples. These courts were strategically placed near the political and religious centers, because Pok wasn't just entertainment. It was spiritual theater, divine performance art in sweat form. The game ball, not a feather-light piece of synthetic fluff. It's a 9-pound solid rubber sphere, basically a cannonball that bounces. It can bruise ribs, break bones, and if it hits you in the face, send your soul directly to Sibylba, the Maya underworld, before the scoreboard updates. The goal, keep the ball in play using everything but your hands, elbows, hips, knees, anything that hurts when it smacks into dense rubber. Bonus points if you manage to hit the ball through one of the stone hoops, an almost impossible feat considering their height, size, and the fact that your shoulders are currently being dislocated by gravity. There were regional variations across the Maya world, but the core idea was the same. Keep the ball moving, avoid fouls like touching it with your hands, and try to score points by bouncing it off the walls or getting it through the ring. No one wore protective gear. Some players wore leather padding on their hips or shins, but this was mostly to delay the bruises, not prevent them. The matches could last hours. The crowd watched, not for goals, but for symbolism, because every bounce echoed the cosmic struggle between light and darkness, life and death, gods and mortals. And you're here thinking this is just a warm-up for the Maya Olympics. No, this is the cosmic rematch of creation, and you're the squishy mortal stand-in. See, Pok wasn't just a game. It was a ritualized reenactment of the Maya creation myth. According to the Popol Vuh, the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, played ball in the underworld and used the game to outsmart the Lords of Death, eventually defeating them and bringing order to the cosmos. So when a game was played in your city-state, it wasn't about who had the best cardio. It was symbolic warfare, a way to align society with divine order, reenact myth, and show off political power. The audience wasn't clapping for goals. They were watching destiny play out in rubber and blood. And here's where things get sporty. There's long been debate about whether the winners or the losers were sacrificed after major ceremonial games. Honestly, depends where and when you're playing. In some versions, the losing team got the chop, literally. In others, the winning captain was considered so honored that he was sacrificed to the gods voluntarily. Either way, heads were sometimes removed and turned into game balls, or so legend goes. Stone carvings from sites like Chichen Itza even depict players kneeling as blood fountains from their necks. Not exactly your typical MVP trophy moment. You, the random outsider drafted into the game because someone thought you had strong hip energy, now find yourself praying you don't score and become too spiritually impressive. Don't lose and disappoint the rain gods, and don't die of a collapsed lung before either of those options occurs. City rulers used pock to pock as political theatre. Rival city-states could settle disputes with a match instead of war, though war still often followed anyway. Games could be used to humiliate captured nobles, display royal dominance, or celebrate celestial events like eclipses or equinoxes. You didn't just watch the ball game, you felt it. You bet on it, sacrificed for it, and in your case, probably bled into the cracks of the stone court while hoping Chak didn't notice you were still breathing. If you thought sports were stressful before, imagine playing with divine judgment on the line, an unpadded ribcage, and a 9-pound reminder that the gods are watching, constantly. So yes, game night in the Maya world was unforgettable, just not necessarily in a fun evening with friends kind of way. Now when you look at the calendar, it says, you're doomed. There are 3 calendars, 5 omens, and 1 very nervous-looking priest. So, not great. You wake up to the sound of conch horns and ceremonial flutes. People are dressed in feathers. Someone's burning incense. And there's a lot of ominous chanting. Naturally, you ask what's going on. Today is 13 Ajar, 3 Kankin, the end of a cantoon. Also, Venus is mad. Right. So, Tuesday? Nope. According to the ancient Maya, it might be the end of the world, or your personal bad luck day, or maybe just a perfectly ordinary day with extremely complicated math. Either way, the calendar says your fate is sealed. And unlike your digital planner, this calendar isn't here to help you stay organized. It's here to tell you what kind of rituals you should perform, what crops to plant, whether today is a good day to start a war, and surprise, whether the gods might want a blood donation, possibly yours. Let's start with the Tzalkin, the 260-day ritual calendar. It's not based on the sun or moon, but rather on some mysterious, sacred cosmic math the Maya decided was important enough to run their spiritual lives. The Tzalkin combines 20-day names like Ajor, Kan, Ike, with 13 numbers in a cycle that spins out like a divine bingo machine. You get combinations like 7 bins or 2 kimi, and each has its own spiritual vibe, taboos, and suggested activities like build a temple, plant maize, or absolutely don't travel unless you want a jaguar problem. Priests called Ajay Kiji interpreted these days the way modern horoscopes pretend to. Today's a good day for negotiating with enemies, but a terrible day for marriage, surgery, or leaving your house. If you're trying to figure out whether today's a good time to avoid being sacrificed, you'll need to check your birth date, spirit animal, day sign, moon phase, and probably your dental alignment. Good luck with that. If the Chizo Kin is your cosmic destiny chart, the Hab is the Maya version of a solar calendar, 365 days long divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus a 5-day bonus round called Wayeb. Wayeb was not fun. Those extra 5 days weren't treated as woohoo long weekend. They were seen as deeply cursed. A time when the boundaries between worlds grew thin, the gods could go rogue, and demons might slip through your bedroom window while you sleep. People fasted, avoided travel, and basically just tried not to make eye contact with any spirits until the real calendar picked back up. So if you arrive in town and hear everyone whispering and hiding their kids while throwing cornmeal around, congratulations, you've shown up during Cosmic Anxiety Week. Then there's the long count calendar, a big picture timeline that tracks literally thousands of years using an elegant base 20 number system and stone-carved math. Think of it as the Maya version of a sci-fi doomsday clock, except instead of it's 2025, it's today is 13, 0.0.0.0, which if you were around in 2012, you might recognize from all the doomsday panic. Yes, that whole Maya calendar predicts the end of the world in 2012. Thing came from one single cycle of the long count coming to an end, a major milestone in Maya timekeeping. To the ancient Maya, this wasn't game over. It was reset day, like your Xbox restarting. Unfortunately, the modern world had no chill, and we all assumed the sky was going to fall. In Maya terms, long count dates mark the birth of gods, the founding of cities, and the resetting of creation. If you hear a priest shouting something about 13 back-turn, don't run for cover, unless of course the local ruler decides it's a good time to impress the gods with another sacrifice. Interpreting the calendar wasn't a hobby, it was a full-time priestly profession. These calendar priests were like astrologers, scientists, shamans, and bureaucrats all rolled into one, and they took time very seriously. They tracked the movements of Venus, solar eclipses, moon phases, and planetary alignments to predict wars, famines, rain cycles, and political events. If Venus disappeared behind the sun, that was a bad omen. If the Hab and Soken lined up in a certain way, even worse. If a bird pooped on your head during Waybird, don't even leave your house. As a clueless outsider, your lack of knowledge about these celestial schedules makes you look suspiciously out of sync with the universe, and that could be enough to land you on the list of things to cleanse with fire. Here's the fun part. All three calendars ran simultaneously. The Tzolk'in and Hab combined in a 52-year cycle known as a calendar round, and every single day in that period had a unique designation. The long count kept track of the big picture in chunks of 144,000 days, and each cycle restart was celebrated with massive ritual fanfare and possibly a bit of screaming. To the Maya, time wasn't a straight line, it was a sacred spiral, filled with cycles, signs, omens, and divine meaning. Time was alive, time had rules, time had moods, and you don't even know what day it is, much less which god you're offending, just by existing. So when the priest looks at the sky, then at you, and says, "Today is inauspicious," just know, you're not being ghosted by the stars. You're being actively rejected by the fabric of the cosmos. Your breakfast doesn't energize you. It threatens you. You wake up groggy, disoriented, and hungry. You think, okay, it's still Mesoamerica, but maybe someone's got a tortilla. What you get is roasted iguana, fermented corn mush, and a side of chili so aggressive it could double as jungle warfare deterrent. Congratulations. You're about to experience ancient Maya cuisine, a diet designed by nature, ritual, and someone who clearly thought fire belonged in every bite. Let's start with the good news. There's corn, lots of it. The Maya didn't just eat maize, they worshipped it, literally. According to the Popol Vuh, humans were created from maize. You are, spiritually speaking, a walking tamale with anxiety. Maize was the holy grail of the Maya pantry, boiled, roasted, ground, fermented, flattened, or stuffed into banana leaves. It was the base of almost everything. Tortillas, check. Tamales, double check. Gruel, of course. Who doesn't love a good soupy corn beverage to start the day? And if you're thinking, well, at least corn's easy on the stomach, don't get too comfy. You're probably drinking a toll, a warm, viscous corn drink that can be spiked with chili, honey, or cacao depending on the mood. Breakfast of champions, or a slippery descent into digestive confusion, both. So you've had your corn paste. Now you're wondering, where's the meat? Answer, crawling past you. The Maya weren't herding cows or raising chickens. Instead, you're looking at turkeys, dogs, armadillos, deer, frogs, and yes, iguanas, roasted, stewed, or dried. Some households even raised hairless Maya dogs tekichi specifically for food. Fluffy companions, more like tomorrow's stew. Fish and shellfish were consumed near coastal areas, but inland, hunting was the name of the game, with blowguns, traps, and sheer tenacity. Jaguars were admired, not eaten, but monkeys? Fair game. You may feel conflicted about that, especially if one stares at you from a tree while you chew, and don't expect a hot grill or a nice glaze. Most meat was boiled or cooked over open flames, seasoned with whatever wild herbs or spicy chilies someone hadn't already used to burn their own eyebrows off. Let's talk about chili peppers, because they are everywhere. The Maya didn't season food, they weaponized it. There are sweet chilies, yes, but they're overshadowed by varieties so potent they might as well come with a fire safety pamphlet. Chilies were crushed, dried, stewed, smoked, and blended into sauces that seemed purpose-built to make you question your life choices. And these weren't optional condiments. Chili was added to everything: sauces, drinks, stews, and even children's disciplinary routines. Yes, Chili vapor in the face was a real punishment method. So when your breakfast tamale comes with a side of red paste that smells like regret and tastes like regret on fire, smile politely and accept your fate. Feeling burned? Good news, dessert is here. Bad news, it's chocolate, but not like you know it. The Maya were among the first to cultivate cacao, and they took it seriously. This wasn't a candy bar. This was a sacred, bitter, frothy beverage, often mixed with chili, corn, or fermented ingredients. They believed cacao was a gift from the gods, used in rituals, offerings, and royal feasts. Drinking cacao was a status symbol, a divine connection. You might see nobles sipping it from ornate vessels during ceremonies or warriors knocking it back before battle like it's a divine espresso shot. But don't expect sugar, that hadn't entered the chat yet. So unless you enjoy your chocolate like a gritty, spicy mud bath, you're in for a surprise. The Maya diet was surprisingly plant-based and complex. You'd also eat a lot of black beans, squash, avocados, manioc, sweet potatoes, chayote, and jicama. Much of it grown in raised fields or on sloped terraces, but the real treats were foraged jungle foods, nuts, wild berries, mushrooms, and medicinal herbs. If it grew, crawled, or squirmed, someone probably figured out how to cook it. Fancy a delicacy? Try honey from stingless bees, or fermented corn beer called chicha. Earthy, sour, and possibly served in a communal gourd. Don't question it, just drink. Food wasn't just fuel, it was deeply spiritual. Maya rituals often involved food offerings. From maize to cacao to blood, see previous chapter, entire festivals were built around planting and harvest cycles, where gods had to be appeased with incense, music, and feasting. And you better believe the menu was curated with cosmic precision. Some meals were only for elites or priests, while others marked specific life events: birth, death, marriage, or initiation. You didn't just eat food, you participated in the divine order with every bite. Too bad your foreign stomach can't keep up. If the gods don't smite you for chewing wrong, the parasites from that unwashed tamale leaf just might. So if you sat down expecting tacos and a margarita, we regret to inform you, you are centuries early and several continent shifts away. Instead, your meal includes a grilled lizard leg, an aggressively smoky corn drink, chili paste so potent it could fuel a rocket, and a cacao beverage that doubles as spiritual armor. Bon appetit, or whatever the Maya word is for. Please tell me that wasn't an eyeball. So you thought you were here for an archaeological sightseeing trip. Maybe take a few selfies with a pyramid, grab some spicy cacao, wave at a priest. Cute. Unfortunately, you've been handed a stone chisel, shoved toward a pile of boulders, and your new job title is human forklift. You're not exploring the pyramids, you're building them, brick by backbreaking brick, with zero machinery, under the blazing sun. Welcome to the ancient Maya construction industry, where sweat is sacred, and breaks are a myth. Let's set the scene. It's midday in the lowlands. The air feels like a wet towel wrapped around your face, and your supervisor, a stern man with jade in his ears and zero patience, tells you to move that block over there. That block? It's made of solid limestone, weighs as much as a hippo, and is going up 4 flights of pyramid stairs. There's no pulley system, no wheels, just ropes, logs, leverage, and a group of increasingly shirtless, increasingly sunburned workers. The Maya didn't just build huts and walls, they constructed sky-piercing temples, multi-story palaces, observatories, and ball courts, all without metal tools or draft animals. These weren't amateur efforts, these were engineering masterpieces, designed to last centuries, which, inconveniently for you, means they required a nightmare level of effort. If you're a commoner, and let's be honest, you definitely are, you've been volunteered for corvée labor. That's the nice way of saying, congratulations, you owe the king a few thousand hours of your spine. During major building projects, entire villages could be conscripted. Farmers became haulers, artisans were repurposed as masons, even teenagers joined in, likely wondering what they did to deserve being born into the world's hottest construction internship. But don't expect a paycheck. Your reward is cosmic merit. Building temples earns spiritual brownie points. The gods smile. The rulers take credit. You get a handful of corn and a permanent limp. Here's your toolkit. A stone chisel, maybe obsidian if you're lucky, a wooden mallet, a basket for carrying rubble, and your own rapidly deteriorating will to live. There were no iron nails, no cranes, and definitely no wheelbarrows. Even the wheel, yes, they knew about it, wasn't used in construction. The Maya built by brute strength and clever design, using lime mortar, precise carving, and interlocking stones that could survive centuries of storms and stomping tourists. For hauling materials, they used wooden rollers, levered sleds, and endless human chains. One guy pushes, one guy pulls. Everyone sweats. Now let's talk design. Maya architecture wasn't just functional, it was cosmic. Temples weren't placed randomly. They aligned with celestial events. The sunrise on the solstice, the movement of Venus, the shadows cast by pyramids during equinoxes. Observatories like El Caracol in Chichen Itza tracked stars with eerie accuracy. These structures were mathematical prayers, physical expressions of Maya cosmology. So when your foreman screams at you to chisel faster, remember, it's not just a building, it's a portal to the divine, a calendar in stone, and a symbol of royal power. The king's ego is on the line, and you're the unfortunate soul with the blisters to prove it. One of the most famous Maya structures, El Castillo in Chichen Itza, rises 79 feet high with 365 steps, one for every day of the Hab year. It wasn't just a marvel of symmetry, it was a stage for rituals, a monument to gods, and a sound amplifier for public announcements, and probably disappointed yelling. Want more fun? During equinoxes, the pyramid casts a shadow of a snake, slithering down the stairs, a feat of precise design that still stuns modern architects. Now imagine building that with zero modern tools, in jungle humidity, under threat of angry gods and grumpier foremen. Still think your office job is hard? Maya cities weren't random piles of rocks. They were intentionally designed urban centers with plazas, raised causeways, sakbob, irrigation systems, and temple complexes, carefully laid out to reflect religious beliefs and social hierarchy. You didn't just slap a pyramid down and call it a day. You had to think about where the sun sets, where the nobles live, where the markets should go, and how to build it without causing a full-blown peasant mutiny. And yes, all of this was accomplished with sheer grit, astronomical knowledge, and community labor, which is a noble way of saying, you carried the bricks, and they got the credit. If you're waiting for lunch break, hydration stations, or unionized rest days, let us gently crush your hopes like your crushed toes. They didn't exist. Water had to be hauled in. Shade was limited. You were expected to work until the gods were pleased, which could mean sunset or never. If someone fainted, they got a splash of water and a motivational grunt. If they collapsed, they became part of the foundation, possibly figuratively, possibly not. By the end of the day, you've hauled 40 blocks, lost 3 pounds in sweat, and gained a deep appreciation for gravity as your worst enemy. The temples may rise toward heaven, but you're flat on the ground, wondering if being sacrificed might be the easier job after all. One moment, you're peacefully tending your cornfield, swatting mosquitoes, and arguing with a neighbor over who owns the best chili pepper bush. The next, a squad of muscular strangers in jaguar pelts is sprinting towards you with spears, shouting something about glory, tribute, and the gods' thirst for blood. Congratulations, you're now the unwilling star of an ancient Maya city-state war. No declaration, no warning, no dramatic speech from a general, just you, your corn basket, and a sharp obsidian blade aimed at your everything. Forget modern countries. The Maya world was made up of dozens, even hundreds, of independent city-states, kingdoms like Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Yaxchilan. Each one ruled over its own slice of jungle, complete with its own king, nobles, temples, scribes, and inflated sense of self-importance. These city-states didn't just coexist peacefully, they were constantly eyeing each other like jealous siblings. Land, trade routes, captives, prestige, all reasons to go from ceremonial dance party to burn their village mode in record time. And alliances? Don't get too cozy. City A might be besties with City B today, and stabbing them tomorrow. It's like a jungle version of high school drama, but with more arrows and fewer group chats. You might imagine war as a clash of massive armies, but in the Maya world, warfare was often targeted, strategic, and highly personal. Maya kings didn't just want to wipe out enemies, they wanted prisoners, especially high-ranking ones. Capturing a rival noble meant humiliating a competing city, gaining leverage in negotiations, and yes, earning bragging rights with the gods. It's like medieval capture the flag, but instead of flags, you're trying to kidnap your opponent's CEO and maybe decapitate him on a temple step later. To do this, Maya warriors trained from youth, learning how to hurl spears, swing clubs, and sneak through jungle terrain. Their weapons, obsidian-tipped spears, atladals, spear throwers, blowguns, and the dreaded makwahutl, a wooden sword embedded with razor-sharp obsidian shards. Think chainsaw made of nightmares, and they didn't wear armor, just padded cotton tunics, and sometimes intimidating jaguar skins or feathers. Protection was secondary. Looking terrifying was the real goal. Now let's return to you, the humble peasant just trying to finish lunch. When war arrived, it often did so suddenly. Cities like Dos Pilas or Bonampak might find themselves attacked out of nowhere. Ambushes, night raids, and hit-and-run assaults were common. Sometimes, a city was besieged. Other times, a palace was stormed, and a king dragged away like stolen royal luggage. The aftermath could be brutal. Temples looted, monuments defaced, commoners enslaved, nobles humiliated, and captives marched off in ropes. If you were lucky, you just lost your crops. If you were unlucky, well, you'd better hope Chak likes your face. Being captured wasn't just about being out of luck. It meant you were valuable. Prisoners weren't always killed right away. In fact, that would be a waste. Elite captives were sometimes held for months or years, paraded in ceremonies like living trophies. Their fate could be public sacrifice during major rituals, political bargaining chips, or forced to watch their city burn while tied to a post. But even regular warriors and farmers might end up sacrificed or enslaved. Your fate depended on your status, your captor's mood, and whether the local gods were feeling peckish. If you survived somehow, you'd see your conquerors immortalize their victory in stone monuments and murals, depicting scenes of glorious war, dramatic battles, and kneeling prisoners awaiting their fate. The Maya loved a good victory mural. Entire cities were like Instagram profiles full of "me, winning again" posts. Bonampak, for example, features murals showing warriors capturing enemies, nobles bleeding from their fingernails, and musicians playing while chaos erupts around them. Nothing says culture like background drummers at a public execution. The wars weren't always about destruction. Often it was about control, intimidation, and flexing divine favor. Tikal and Calakmul were like the Coca-Cola and Pepsi of the classic Maya era. Locked in a rivalry for centuries, they formed alliances with smaller cities, staged attacks through proxies, and tried to outbuild each other in temples and war records. And you're the poor pawn on this sweaty, blood-stained jungle chessboard. Your fate is sealed by kings who pray to gods you don't fully understand, over territory you just wanted to farm in peace. Let's assess your chances. You don't know who's allied with who. You can't identify the war drums until it's too late. Your village militia consists of 3 guys and a half-sharpened stick. And worst of all, you look just valuable enough to take alive. Whether you're sacrificed to the gods, enslaved for labor, or forced to watch your city fall, one thing's clear. You were not built for ancient geopolitics with obsidian blades. You survived the snakes, sacrifices, and chili. But now, the gods have ghosted you. Congratulations. You've somehow made it through being a corn peasant, dodged obsidian-tipped spears, choked down roasted iguana, and survived not being mistaken for a ceremonial piñata during a bloodletting ritual. You've even developed decent abs from hauling limestone blocks and sprinting away from angry city-state warriors. But just when you think you've earned a peaceful jungle retirement, the entire civilization implodes. And no, it's not one dramatic, fiery bang. It's more like a 500-year slow-motion landslide, where everything important crumbles while the elite pretend nothing's wrong, and the gods stop answering your calls. Welcome to the classic Maya collapse. It's not personal, just apocalyptic. Let's clear something up. The Maya collapse wasn't like Atlantis going underwater in a single day. It was regional, gradual, and messy. Like a civilization forgetting to renew its subscription to being functional. Between 750 and 900 CE, dozens of once thriving city-states in the southern lowlands, places like Tikal, Copan, Palenque, and Dos Pilas, began to decline, depopulate, and flat-out vanish. Pyramids were left half-built, palaces crumbled, royal tombs stayed sealed, and suddenly, That guy you used to trade cacao beans with was just gone. Let's start with the environment. The Maya had mastered the jungle, carving cities from vines, farming maize in the rainforest, and building enormous stone monuments in a place where moss eats buildings for breakfast. But they may have gotten a bit too good at expansion. To keep up with growing populations and hungry gods, they deforested huge areas for construction, farming, and firewood. That meant less rain catchment, soil degradation, erosion, and eventually famine. It's like cutting down your only umbrella before a thunderstorm. Only you've got 10,000 people waiting for lunch. Now throw in a megadrought. Paleoclimate data suggests that between 800 900 CE, the skies dried up, the rain stopped partying, and the crops gave up. Rivers shrank, reservoirs dried, and the sacred cenotes weren't so sacred anymore. Just big holes of regret. Even as the jungle browned and bellies grumbled, the nobility kept building pyramids and demanding tribute like nothing was wrong. The Maya elite clung to tradition like a TikTok influencer clings to trends, long past the point of relevance. They doubled down on ceremonies, sacrifices, and war, hoping the gods would fix things if they just performed the rituals harder. Spoiler, it didn't work. Commoners, fed up with growing corn for a starving king, likely revolted, fled, or abandoned cities entirely. Some archaeologists suggest internal strife, civil unrest, and loss of faith in leadership played as big a role as drought and starvation. So yes, you might not die on the altar, but you will die slowly in a crumbling city, where nobody remembers why you're supposed to stay. One eerie symptom of collapse, the monuments stop. For hundreds of years, Maya cities were addicted to self-promotion, carving every king's victory, marriage and haircut into stone. But by the end of the 9th century, stelae across the southern lowlands went quiet. No new dates, no new rulers, just silence. That's like checking your city's official Instagram and realizing no one's posted since 862 CE. Here's the plot twist. The Maya people never disappeared. Their political centers collapsed. Yes, many cities were abandoned, and the classic period fizzled out, but Maya culture persisted, evolved, and still exists today. Millions of Maya descendants live in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They speak modern versions of ancient languages like Kaqchiche, Yucatec, and Tzotzil. They maintain traditional practices, crafts, and yes, even some of the same agricultural methods their ancestors used 1,200 years ago. So no, you're not watching an extinction. You're watching a rebirth. A civilization shedding its massive stone temples and finding new ways to survive. Well, you lasted longer than anyone expected. You survived bloodletting and chili-related trauma, learned a few glyphs, barely, avoided being sacrificed twice, didn't get drafted into a war that you know of, and now you're watching the jungle reclaim your city like it's cashing in on unpaid rent. You're not dying dramatically. You're dying in the slow collapse of a civilization that tried to outbuild, outprey, and outfarm a hostile jungle, and lost. The pyramids are empty. The priests are confused. The gods, silent. All that's left now is the echo of a people who lived, built, fought, and fed the gods with blood, and whose legacy still whispers in the stones and forests. Before she became France's most infamous fashion icon, scandal magnet, and accidental symbol of revolution, Marie Antoinette was just Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, which is a name so long it needed its own luggage tag. Born in 1755 as the 15th child, yes, 15th of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, Maria Antonia entered the world already doomed to a life of strategic awkwardness. Because in royal Europe, children weren't raised for love, they were raised for treaties. Being a Habsburg meant you were born with two things: an impressive jawline and a high chance of being married off to someone you'd never met for reasons you didn't understand. Maria Theresa, a ruler known for combining ruthless politics with aggressive Catholic guilt, ran her family like a monarchy-themed HR department, and one of her biggest corporate mergers involved marrying her teenage daughter off to France. Now, France and Austria hadn't exactly been besties. In fact, for most of the 18th century, they had been throwing shade and cannonballs at each other across Europe. But in a twist, worthy of a soap opera reboot, the two nations decided they should stop trying to blow each other up and start sharing wine and in-laws instead. Enter the diplomatic revolution of 1756. Basically the political version of two exes getting back together for the kids. The deal? Austria would offer up young Maria Antonia to marry the French Dauphin, Louis Auguste, future Louis XVI, and spoiler alert, future headless monarch. She was 14, he was 15. Neither was emotionally prepared to run a lemonade stand, let alone an empire. The transformation from Maria Antonia to Marie Antoinette was swift and weirdly ceremonial. Before she even crossed into France, her Austrian clothes were stripped off. Her name was Frenchified, and her entourage replaced. A royal makeover meant to scrub off the stink of foreignness. She was now French property, in both the marital and geopolitical sense. Imagine going through puberty while being rebranded like a bag of imported coffee beans. Let's talk education. Or, more accurately, the absence of one. While her older siblings had the benefit of decent tutors, Maria Antonia was raised in a kind of chaotic, under-supervised court daycare. She learned to dance and sing beautifully, sure, but reading and writing, optional. Her French was shaky, her grasp of politics non-existent, and her understanding of what she was about to walk into, absolutely zero. She could play the harp like an angel, but couldn't read a French political pamphlet if her life depended on it, which, ironically, it later would. When she finally arrived at Versailles in 1770, her welcome was warm, at first, but to the French, she was always the Austrian, not a princess, but an import, like a crate of expensive cheese that smelled a little too foreign. The French elite never fully accepted her, and the common people, well, they weren't thrilled that their future queen couldn't even pronounce half the country's vowels properly. Versailles was a whole other ecosystem, a zoo where the animals wore silk and gossiped in Latin. The court had more rules than a modern airline, and Marie was expected to memorize all of them overnight. Who to bow to, how to hold a spoon, which direction to fart in. Everything was monitored. And the stakes, well, let's just say unladylike behavior in France didn't get you grounded. It got you a satirical woodcut circulated nationwide. Then there was Louis, poor, sweet, awkward Louis, more interested in clocks and locks than, let's say, other duties of a royal husband. Their marriage, like the diplomatic deal it represented, was a slow-moving disaster disguised as a celebration. While Europe toasted their union with powdered wigs and parades, the royal bedroom stayed eerily quiet for years, and Marie meanwhile was expected to start producing heirs like a royal Pez dispenser. In short, Marie Antoinette didn't ask to be France's queen. She didn't even ask to leave Vienna. She was a teen girl used as a band-aid on a centuries-old rivalry between nations. She arrived at Versailles with no power, little education, and the heavy pressure of an entire empire on her powdered shoulders. Not exactly a recipe for success, but she was beautiful, charming, and underneath the layers of silk and expectation, dangerously human. And in a world where public opinion turned faster than a Parisian gossip wheel, that would soon become her greatest liability. Welcome to the Palace of Versailles, the only place in history where it was perfectly normal to have an audience while putting on your pants. When 14-year-old Marie Antoinette first rolled up to the French court in 1770, she didn't just walk into a new home. She entered an elite social circus that made the Hunger Games look like summer camp. Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was a lifestyle brand, built on etiquette, arrogance, and powdered drama. Imagine being a teenage foreigner who barely speaks the language, suddenly thrown into a world where how you curtsy could determine your popularity, and not in a mean girls at school way, more like mean dukes with titles and grudges who can ruin your life in a powdered heartbeat. The moment Marie stepped into court, she became a walking symbol of diplomatic unity, feminine grace, and extreme public scrutiny. Even her dog had critics. Everything about her, from the angle of her fan to the tightness of her bodice, was analysed by nobles who had nothing better to do. Court life was basically one long, slow-moving Instagram feed of judgment. And let's talk about Versailles itself. Built to impress, intimidate, and confuse anyone trying to find the bathroom, it had hundreds of rooms, endless gold leaf, and not a single ounce of chill. The ceilings were painted with gods. The halls echoed with the sounds of gossip, perfume, and petty ambition. It was like living in a mansion designed by a very wealthy drama teacher with a chandelier addiction. But grandeur came at a cost, namely, privacy, none, zero, zilch. As the Dauphine, Marie's life was a 24/7 reality show, and not the fun kind with prize money. Her mornings began with the lever, a ceremony where courtiers watched her wake up and get dressed, not helped, watched. That was a real thing. Even going to bed was a public affair, involving specific attendants, prescribed good nights, and an audience. It was less peaceful rest, and more awkward performance art in nightgowns. Versailles had so many rules that even blinking had guidelines. Okay, not quite, but it felt that way. And then there was her marriage, a word that here means two teenagers who'd rather be anywhere else. Marie was married to Louis Auguste, who would become Louis XVI. At the time, he was a shy, bookish 15-year-old with the energy of a nervous librarian and the libido of a houseplant. Their relationship started off not with fireworks, but with, well, silence. They were polite to each other, sure, but passion was nowhere to be found, in a court obsessed with airs and gossip. This was a big problem. 7 years passed before the marriage was consummated. And trust us, the whole palace was keeping score. Theories abounded. Was it physical? Psychological? Did Louis just prefer his lock-making hobby to actual intimacy? Historians still argue about it. All we know is that a king's inability to get things moving in the bedroom became a national crisis, and poor Marie, barely out of her teens, was blamed for all of it. Because in the 18th century, if your royal husband didn't want to sleep with you, it was obviously your fault. Maybe your hips weren't fertile looking enough. Maybe your aura wasn't regal enough. Maybe your ancestors didn't include enough Greek gods. Whatever the reason, whispers followed her everywhere. And since Versailles was one big whisper factory, Marie couldn't escape. Courtiers passed judgment, like it was a competitive sport. Nobles ranked each other's outfits. Hierarchies were enforced with snubs and eyebrow raises. Even choosing the wrong seat at dinner could trigger a scandal. So what did Marie do to cope? She played the role. She dressed up. She learned the gestures. She smiled until her cheeks hurt, because Versailles demanded perfection, or at least the appearance of it. And at 14 she was expected to behave like a fully formed political symbol. No pressure, right? She became a mannequin for diplomacy, a doll dressed in layers of silk and protocol. And all the while she was still just a teenager, far from home, surrounded by people who resented her accent, her background, and her womb's lack of productivity. Versailles didn't give second chances. One awkward laugh, one misstep, and suddenly you were a scandal. Marie learned quickly that being royal wasn't about ruling, it was about surviving. And in this palace of mirrors and masks, survival meant performing constantly. So no, she didn't get to grow up like a normal girl. She got ceremonial underpants, husband-related anxiety, and 700 rooms she couldn't cry in without someone commenting on it. Versailles was glittering. Versailles was glorious. But for a teenage Dauphine in a foreign land, Versailles sucked. If Versailles was a royal pressure cooker, Marie Antoinette didn't just let off steam. She threw on a diamond tiara and hosted the after-party. By the time Marie hit her 20s, she'd decided that if France insisted on watching her every move, she might as well give them something fabulous to look at. So she did what any over-monitored, underloved teen bride with access to obscene wealth would do. She reinvented herself as France's most fashionable, flirtatious, and occasionally fiscally reckless icon. It started with the hair. The poff, as it came to be known, was less of a hairstyle and more of a statement piece. Towering wigs that could reach over 2 feet high were perched on noble heads, often decorated with feathers, ships, yes, ships, fake fruit, and entire miniature battle reenactments. One popular pouf depicted a French naval victory. Another featured a working model of a garden. Marie's hair wasn't just on trend. It was the trend, the hashtag, and the influencer all at once. She worked with her stylist Leonard Autier, a man who basically invented the concept of the celebrity hairdresser, to create increasingly absurd masterpieces. Getting ready could take hours. Birds nested, servants wept, gravity sighed. Next came the clothes. Marie's dresses weren't just expensive, they were financial black holes wrapped in satin. The robe à la Française was already a complicated, drapey ordeal, but Marie took it further. Ruffles, flounces, bows the size of actual livestock, silk imported from the East, lace-stitched by nuns with magnifying glasses, and enough whalebone to sink a Greenpeace ship. Every outfit was a carefully curated flex. She wore new dresses daily, sometimes multiple times a day. At one point, she reportedly spent the modern equivalent of millions per year on clothes alone. If fashion had a budget cap, Marie yeeted it straight into the sun, and then came Petite Terrien, her own personal royal sandbox, a gift from Louis XVI, likely as a please stop being sad/bored/judged gesture. The Petite Terrien was a small chateau on the Versailles grounds, but functioned more like Marie's ultra-exclusive escape pod. At Petite Terrien there were no rigid court rules, no etiquette police, and very few powdered snobs. Here Marie could let her hair down figuratively. Literally, the hair still had scaffolding. She hosted private dinners, musical performances, masked balls, and elaborate garden parties. She had her own little theatre built, where she sometimes acted on stage, which was controversial, because acting was considered a slightly shady, low-class profession. Nobles were supposed to attend the theatre, not perform in it. But Marie didn't care. She was playing queen and ingenue, and loving it. But where she saw personal freedom, the public saw scandal. To the average peasant, Marie wasn't just playing dress-up. She was allegedly bleeding the treasury dry to cosplay as a milkmaid, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong. She famously took to wearing a style called the chemise à la reine, a loose white muslin gown that looked like very fancy pajamas. It was meant to reflect simplicity, but critics lost their powdered minds. "She's dressing like a servant," they gasped. "She's disrespecting tradition," they cried. But the real problem, it was popular. Every fashionable woman in Paris wanted one. Suddenly, silk weavers were out of work. Muslin prices soared, and Marie was blamed for both bad taste and bad economics. Then there was the gambling. Versailles ran on vices, and cards were one of them. Marie was a regular at late-night games where fortunes could change hands faster than powdered wigs could fall off. She lost money, sometimes obscene amounts, but to her, it wasn't reckless. It was normal. Everyone was doing it. Except Marie didn't have the luxury of being just one of the crowd. Every coin she lost was seen as another grain of bread stolen from the people's mouths. Even if technically her gambling losses weren't anywhere close to what the French government was wasting elsewhere. Still, perception is everything. To the outside world, Marie Antoinette was a sparkling, careless socialite twirling through a collapsing kingdom in embroidered slippers. They didn't see the pressure, the isolation, the palace politics, or the fact that she was still, at heart, trying to find her footing in a country that never really accepted her. But in the candle-lit halls of Petite Terrien, amidst the laughter, music, and absurdly large hairpieces, Marie felt like herself, or at least the version of herself she preferred, not Austria's pawn, not France's scapegoat, just Marie. Unfortunately, France didn't want a queen who threw garden parties. They wanted miracles, bread, a scapegoat in silk, if nothing else. And Marie Antoinette, fashion goddess and full-time headline, was about to find out just how expensive being misunderstood could be. While Marie Antoinette was hosting musical nights in a silk dress that cost more than a farm, the rest of France was trying to figure out whether dirt could be considered a food group. Let's zoom out from Versailles' gold leaf glamour and take a detour to, say, rural Normandy, or a back alley in Paris. Spoiler, things were not going great. The 1780s in France were what economists like to call an absolute financial dumpster fire. First, the national debt. France was already deep in the red from the 7 Years' War, an expensive global conflict where France lost colonies, pride, and barrels of coin. Then along came the American Revolution, and France, ever eager to poke Britain in the eye, funded the American rebels. It was like maxing out your credit card to help your neighbor fight his landlord, while your own roof was on fire. France loaned the Americans millions of livres. That's not monopoly money, with nothing coming back but thank you notes and awkward 4th of July barbecues. By 1787, France's debt had ballooned to catastrophic levels. The government's spending exceeded its income by a margin that would make a modern hedge fund manager weep. Interest payments alone devoured over half of the state's revenue, and they weren't exactly cutting costs. The royal household still required diamonds, banquets, and swan-shaped soup tureens, enter the harvest failures. Because, of course, just as the budget hit rock bottom, Mother Nature decided to go full scorched earth, literally. The winters of 1787 and 1788 were so severe they froze rivers solid. Crops died. Livestock starved. The following harvests were miserable, and grain prices skyrocketed. Now, keep in mind that bread wasn't just a casual breakfast item, it was life. For most French peasants, it made up 80% of their daily diet, so when bread prices doubled or tripled, it wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. One pamphlet from the time records families boiling grass and baking mud to survive. People sold their clothes, tools, or children. Yes, that bad just to get a few stale loaves. In some places, riots broke out when rumors spread that bakers were hoarding flour. Bread wasn't just food, it was a spark in a powder keg. Now imagine you're a starving farmer who just spent your last coin on a handful of moldy wheat. You go to town and hear the latest gossip. The Queen wore a silk gown that took 300 hours to stitch. She's hosting a masked ball with imported oranges. Her latest hairstyle required scaffolding and an ostrich. Suddenly, the monarchy's glitter doesn't just feel distant, it feels insulting. Marie Antoinette wasn't out personally punching peasants, but from the outside, it certainly looked like she was dancing on the ashes of the poor. Even if she wasn't the one writing the checks, she became the face of the excess, the feathered, powdered, and blissfully oblivious face. There was also the optics problem. As France's economy sank faster than a wig in the sand, the palace just kept flexing. The royal budget was never transparent. The common people didn't know where their taxes were going, but they did know that the Queen had a rustic peasant hamlet in her garden. For fun, to play dress-up. With milkmaids and sheep. It was like if Jeff Bezos built a cardboard box fort in his backyard and called it Living Simply. Meanwhile, taxation was wildly unfair. The people who could least afford to pay, the peasants, small landowners and merchants, were the ones being squeezed. The aristocracy, exempt. The clergy, exempt. The royal family, obviously exempt. Imagine being taxed into oblivion to support a system where the wealthiest citizens literally never saw a bill. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a full-blown societal meltdown. The Enlightenment had lit a fuse under the old world order. More and more, the people were questioning divine right, royal privilege, and the idea that some humans were born to feast while others were born to crawl through the mud looking for turnips. So when people saw the palace sparkling while children starved, when they read about 12-course royal dinners while they boiled bark, resentment didn't just simmer, it boiled. Marie Antoinette, whether fairly or not, became the symbol of it all. She didn't invent the debt. She didn't command the sky to freeze the wheat. But she did wear diamonds while France wore rags, and in the court of public opinion, that was enough. The country wasn't just broke, it was angry. And when a nation gets angry enough, no amount of gold trim or rococo furniture can save the regime. Because at the end of the day, if the only thing standing between a hungry mob and a banquet hall is a fancy gate and some powdered courtiers, well, let's just say the revolution was already sharpening its knives. Long before tabloids, TMZ, or trending hashtags, Marie Antoinette had already been publicly shredded in the court of public opinion, with ink, innuendo, and a level of slander so intense it could make modern gossip blogs blush. By the late 1780s, France didn't just dislike their queen, they dragged her, drew her, and libeled her into infamy. Let's start with the elephant in the Versailles ballroom. Let them eat cake. The quote that Marie Antoinette never said, but became forever stapled to her legacy like a scarlet out of touch badge. The phrase in French, quils mangent de la brioche, was attributed to a great princess in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written when Marie was barely 9 years old and still playing with dolls in Austria. But facts, as history often proves, are no match for a good meme. The idea that the Queen, upon hearing her subjects couldn't afford bread, shrugged, and suggested they chow down on luxury pastry, was too perfect. It wasn't about truth, it was about symbolism, and let them eat cake was the guillotine's version of a catchphrase. Marie didn't need to say it, she just had to look like the kind of person who would. That image didn't appear by accident. It was cultivated, marinated, and slow roasted in the fiery depths of libels. Cheap, scandalous pamphlets that made today's clickbait look like Pulitzer-winning journalism. Libels were sold in back alleys, cafes, and even smuggled into Versailles itself, and they didn't hold back. If you wanted erotica, featuring the Queen and a suspicious number of noble women and guards, there was a libel for that. If you craved a spicy exposé about Marie bankrupting France with hat purchases, or engaging in lesbian affairs, incest, political espionage, or even satanic rituals, well, buckle up, because the French underground press delivered. And no, this wasn't just a few edgy cartoons. These pamphlets painted Marie Antoinette as a sex-crazed foreign vampire, draining the lifeblood of France, with terrible fashion sense no less. She was called Madame Deficit, l'Autrichienne, and worse. Some drawings showed her literally being devoured by mobs, or lounging on piles of taxpayer gold while peasants begged below. One illustration, barely safe for polite company, featured Marie and a line of lovers, each less clothed than the last. Another suggested she and her husband were both sexually incompetent and depraved, because why settle for one insult when you can do a 2-for-1? Why all this bile? Well, first, she was Austrian. In France, this was like being the Yankees fan in a room full of Red Sox diehards. Austria had been a long-time enemy, and many French citizens never fully accepted Marie as one of their own. To them, she was a foreign interloper, a spy in high heels, sent to ruin France from the inside with frilly dresses and powdered wigs. Second, she was a woman in power, and worse, she was visible. She spent, she hosted, she performed, and she didn't apologize for any of it. In an era when queens were supposed to quietly breed heirs and embroider samplers, Marie was front and center, performing plays, designing outfits, being seen, and nothing angers a conservative public more than a powerful woman enjoying herself. And third, let's face it, she had truly terrible PR. While France descended into chaos, Marie remained mostly silent. She wasn't out on palace balconies giving speeches or writing heartfelt manifestos. She didn't explain her spending. She didn't correct the rumors. In her mind, silence was dignified. To the people, it looked like guilt. By the time the affair of the diamond necklace exploded, a convoluted scandal involving stolen jewels, a fake Marie Antoinette, forged letters, and an incredibly gullible cardinal, the public had been so thoroughly poisoned against her that even innocence looked suspicious. She had no idea what was going on. She'd never ordered the necklace, but when the story broke, everyone just assumed, of course she did. She probably bought it to wear to a peasant's funeral. That's how far the rot had spread. Truth, nuance, and basic facts were crushed under the weight of public fury and gossip. If Marie Antoinette sneezed, the pamphlets accused her of blowing taxpayer money out her nostrils. In short, she was the internet's favorite villain before the internet even existed. So when the revolution came knocking, Marie wasn't just seen as a queen. She was a cartoon villain, a living meme in a corset, a walking reminder of everything wrong with monarchy, privilege, and imported pastry logic. The real Marie? Complex, flawed, sometimes oblivious. Not the monster they drew, but not the saint her defenders later tried to craft either. But by then, it didn't matter. The public had roasted her beyond recognition. And when your nickname is Madame Deficit, and people hand out pamphlets depicting you dancing in blood, let's just say the PR recovery window has closed. If Marie Antoinette's public image was a teetering Jenga tower of gossip and resentment, the affair of the diamond necklace was the hand that yanked out the bottom block and shouted, "Oops, this scandal had everything: forged letters, a gullible cardinal, a con artist, pretending to be besties with the queen, a prostitute dressed as royalty in the middle of a moonlit garden, and, naturally, a diamond necklace so extravagant it could fund a small country twice." It was the 18th century equivalent of a Netflix true crime docuseries, and the French public binge-watched every messy second. Let's rewind. It all started with a necklace. Not just any necklace. This thing was the Beyoncé of bling. Nearly 650 diamonds. Sparkled so hard, it needed its own zip code. Price tag? Roughly 1.6 million livres, or enough to buy 2,000 loaves of bread every day for several years. It was originally commissioned for Madame du Barry, the last mistress of Louis V. But when he died, no one wanted to touch it. Especially not Marie Antoinette, who had zero interest in sporting her dead father-in-law's final please, "Don't leave me" gift. Fast forward to the con. Enter Jane de la Motte, a noble woman in name, grifter in practice. She saw the necklace collecting dust and thought, time to commit royal-level fraud. Jan convinced Cardinal de Rohan, a socially ambitious clergyman desperate to win back the Queen's favour, that she was secretly close with Marie Antoinette. She forged letters from the Queen, full of sugary praise and royal emojis in spirit. Cardinal Rohan, apparently unfamiliar with red flags or handwriting analysis, fell for it completely. But it gets wilder. To seal the Queen's approval, Jan hired a prostitute named Nicole de Liva to dress up as Marie Antoinette for a secret nighttime meeting with the Cardinal in the gardens of Versailles. Picture it. Flickering lanterns, dramatic cloaks, a fake queen whispering sweet nothings in a voice that probably sounded suspiciously not Austrian. The Cardinal left the meeting giddy, convinced the Queen loved him. A man hadn't misread a situation this badly since the Trojan horse. Eventually, Rohan agreed to buy the diamond necklace on Marie Antoinette's behalf. Assuming she'd pay later, he arranged for it to be delivered to Jenny's people, who promptly vanished like the last eclair at a royal banquet. When the fraud unraveled, it exploded across Paris like a powder keg wrapped in diamonds. Marie Antoinette had absolutely nothing to do with it, but her name was dragged right into the center like a glittery scapegoat. The public didn't care about the facts, they cared about the vibe, and the vibe was that Marie had somehow orchestrated this whole glitzy crime to feed her obsession with jewels, status, and bankrupting the state, one accessory at a time. Remember, this was a France already choking on debt and bread riots, and now there was a story about a queen getting a $1,000,000 necklace while babies starved. Cue the fury. The trial became a spectacle. Rohan, too embarrassed to admit he got catfished by a royal LARP session, insisted the Queen had orchestrated everything. Jeanne played the victim. Nicole, the prostitute, surprisingly chill about the whole situation. And Marie? She didn't even get a say. She was dragged into a public humiliation, tried by association, and painted as both manipulative and foolish. A rare double indictment. When Rohan was acquitted, despite being an idiot in this scenario, the people cheered, not for justice, but for revenge. They saw the verdict as a slap in the Queen's perfectly powdered face. The con artists, basically folk heroes. Jen was even sentenced to prison but escaped dressed as a boy, because apparently this story wasn't dramatic enough yet. The fallout was nuclear. Marie Antoinette's image, already hanging by a diamond thread, was now unfixable. Satirical prints and songs mocked her. One cartoon showed her sitting on a throne made of jewels while France burned. Another pamphlet declared, "She robs the people not only of bread, but of reason." And the kicker? The necklace, the sparkly, cursed, $1,000,000 monstrosity, was never worn. It was broken up and sold on the black market, reduced to diamond confetti for rich strangers. So, to recap, the Queen didn't want the necklace. She never saw it. She didn't write the letters. She didn't meet the Cardinal. And yet, she was the villain of the entire affair. Why? Because when the story's that juicy, the facts don't stand a chance. Marie Antoinette was tried in the tabloids of her day, and in the eyes of a starving, seething France, she was guilty of the worst crime imaginable, looking like the kind of queen who absolutely would scam a necklace while laughing over cake. It didn't matter what the truth was. The image had stuck, and the damage was permanent. For most of her adult life, Marie Antoinette lived in a fantasy bubble, where the biggest emergency was a wig collapsing under its own gravity. That bubble popped in 1789, not with a whimper, but with the sound of the Bastille's gates crashing down, and thousands of angry Parisians asking, "Hey, where's that queen with the cake?" By this point, the French people weren't just annoyed, they were done. Done with the debt, the breadlines, the tax system where nobles paid nothing and peasants paid everything. Done with Versailles, acting like a luxury resort while the rest of the country was basically a smouldering economic landfill. Enter July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille, a medieval fortress turned prison. The Bastille wasn't exactly bursting with political prisoners. It held just 7 people, one of whom was literally a crazy old aristocrat who thought he was Julius Caesar. But facts didn't matter, symbolism did. The Bastille represented royal tyranny, and tearing it down was like giving the finger to centuries of monarchy. Marie Antoinette's reaction? Detached, confused. According to palace gossip, she was more worried about her children catching colds than about mobs chanting death to the aristocracy. Versailles, for all its mirrors and gold, had no rearview mirror. The royal family didn't see the truck of revolution barreling straight toward them. But it was coming, and it had receipts. Just a few months later, things went from tense to torch and pitchfork musical. On October 5th, 1789, thousands of angry women marched from Paris to Versailles. Why? Bread. More specifically, the lack of it. Prices had skyrocketed. Supply was non-existent. Mothers couldn't feed their kids, so naturally, they picked up kitchen knives, broomsticks, and whatever else was handy, and walked 12 miles in the rain, furious and very much not in the mood for royal excuses. What began as a protest turned into a full-blown siege. The women broke through palace gates. Some guards were killed. Others fled, or tried reasoning with people who hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Not ideal negotiation material. Marie Antoinette was famously asleep when the attack began. When awoken, she had to flee barefoot through secret corridors with her children, while the crowd stormed her chambers. If they'd arrived minutes earlier, France's history might have turned into a slasher film. The mob demanded a royal appearance. Louis XVI gave one, but the crowd wasn't satisfied. They wanted Marie, so she appeared, alone, on the balcony. For the first time, the Queen of France wasn't surrounded by perfumed courtiers or golden chairs. She was staring into a sea of furious, starving faces, and something weird happened for a moment. They didn't kill her. She stood tall. She bowed. She didn't cry. A strange hush fell. Some even shouted, "Vive la reine!" But it wasn't forgiveness. It was a brief pause before the political execution began. The message was clear. You work for us now. The royal family was forced to leave Versailles, not as rulers, but as prisoners politely referred to as guests of the people. Their destination? The Tuileries Palace in Paris, a glorified cage masquerading as a royal residence. The move was symbolic and strategic. In Versailles, the king was untouchable, encased in ritual and ceremony. In Paris, he was reachable, watchable, and very much under the thumb of the revolution. Crowds now had front-row seats to royal discomfort. The political shift was seismic. The National Assembly, once a rebellious scribble in the margins of governance, now held real power. Constitutional monarchy was the word of the day. A concept that essentially boiled down to sure you can keep your crown, but we're going to break all your furniture and tell you how to wear it. Marie Antoinette didn't adapt well. She hated Paris. She missed Versailles. She viewed the revolutionaries as barbarians. And she wasn't wrong exactly. But saying it out loud probably didn't help. She spent her days writing letters to foreign allies, praying someone would ride in and restore order, preferably on horseback, preferably with cannons. Meanwhile, the people outside were starving, radicalizing and reading daily pamphlets about how the Queen was bathing in champagne and plotting to flee with stolen silverware. She wasn't. She didn't even like champagne baths. Too fizzy. The monarchy's fall was no longer a distant possibility. It was now daily theatre, acted out in real time by a nervous king, a defiant queen, and a crowd that had learned they could bend power with a broomstick. From this point forward, Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen. She was a symbol, a walking, corseted target for revolutionary wrath. Her palace had become a prison. Her guards had become spies. Her fans, mostly replaced by angry pamphlets depicting her riding pigs or guillotining peasants with diamond-encrusted fans. And Versailles, the palace of 700 rooms and zero privacy, it was now just a ghost of a monarchy. Empty halls, faded echoes, and the knowledge that for the first time in centuries the people had walked through the front gate and taken the crown with them. At a certain point, even royals reached their limit with pitchforks, pamphlets, and peasant mobs yelling outside the window. For Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, that moment came in June 1791, when they looked around their new palace in Paris, aka glorified house arrest in the Tuileries, and thought, you know what, we should probably get out of here. What followed was the flight to Varennes, a plan so poorly executed, it makes most school plays look like MI6 operations. Their escape was supposed to be subtle, discreet, a quiet exit from the revolution, after which they'd regroup, re-establish control, and maybe write a sternly worded royal comeback tour. Instead, it was a clunky, bloated, and painfully slow game of aristocratic hide-and-seek, where the hiding party was wearing powdered wigs and still expected people to bow. Let's unpack this slow-motion disaster. First off, Marie and Louis didn't just want to flee Paris. They wanted to reach Montmedy, a fortress town near the Austrian border. where loyal royalist troops were waiting. From there they could rally support and possibly reinstate themselves as the monarchy France suddenly remembered it needed. Spoiler, it didn't. Now, you'd expect a stealthy escape to involve travel light, wear humble clothing, take back roads, all the usual espionage cliches. But this was 18th century royalty, and subtlety wasn't exactly in their DNA. They left at night, yes, but instead of 2 horses and an alias, they opted for a massive 6-horse coach the size of a wine cellar, complete with silver detailing and matching outfits for the servants. It was the kind of getaway vehicle that screams, "Notice me." They disguised themselves. Sort of. Louis posed as a valet named Durand. Marie was dressed as a governess. The children were noble orphans, and their noble nanny was still obviously a noble nanny. The problem? Louis XVI was terrible at pretending not to be king. He was a giant, slow-moving man with a distinctive face. It had literally been stamped on currency for years. Asking him to blend in was like asking the Eiffel Tower to wear a hat and pretend it was a tree. The journey began late on June 20th, 1791. They were supposed to leave around midnight, but in true royal fashion, they were several hours late because Marie had too many bags. Seriously, she brought enough luggage to start a side business in the Alps. Once on the road, everything that could go wrong did. The carriage was so heavy, it moved slower than a herd of snails riding backwards. They were supposed to switch horses frequently to keep pace, but delays stacked up like bad bets in Versailles. Town after town saw them pass. Some villagers even recognized Louis and waved, completely unaware he was fleeing the country. They just assumed he was touring the provinces for fun, possibly rating inns on Yelp. Then came the real kicker. Saint-Ménehoud, a local postmaster, Jean-Baptiste Drouet, stared at the big man in the fancy coach, blinked, and went, "Wait a minute. That's the guy from the coins." Instead of quietly shrugging it off like a good citizen of the Ancien regime, he hopped on a horse and raced ahead to alert the authorities in the town of Varennes. By the time the royal family rolled in, sweaty, late, and painfully unaware, the trap was set. Gendarmes were waiting. Town officials blocked the bridge. And just like that, the royal road trip was over, 30 miles short of safety. They were recognized, arrested, and humiliated. Not with gunfire or fanfare, but by regular people with decent eyesight and better timing. Louis tried to talk his way out of it. Marie tried to explain they were just traveling for the children's health. The officials weren't buying it. Neither were the townspeople who gathered in crowds, shocked to find out the king had run, and worse, lied about it. By the time they were escorted back to Paris, under guard, in broad daylight, through jeering crowds, the damage was irreversible. Trust was shattered. The illusion that the monarchy could coexist with the revolution evaporated. It was now clear, Louis and Marie weren't just figureheads. They were plotting escape, collusion, and maybe even counter-revolution. The people felt betrayed. After all, they'd let the royals live. They'd moved them to the Tuileries. They fed them grudgingly. And this was the thanks they got. A midnight carriage heist with royal toddlers and silver cutlery. Even the moderate revolutionaries were rattled. The whole idea of a constitutional monarchy, a king who behaved himself, stayed in the box, and waved politely during parades, now looked like wishful thinking. If the king didn't believe in the new France, how could France believe in him? And Marie? Any remaining shred of sympathy burned away during the ride back. She became, in the eyes of many, not just a tone-deaf foreign queen, but an active traitor, an enemy within the walls. The revolution had given her a leash, and she tried to chew through it with silk gloves on. After Varennes, the monarchy was no longer sick. It was terminal. The guillotine didn't come that day, but it quietly sharpened itself. By late 1793, Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen, a trendsetter, or even a particularly controversial public figure. She was something worse. A symbol, a walking, powdered scapegoat for every famine, tax, and injustice. The revolutionaries could cram into a pamphlet. Her husband had already lost his head in January of that year, and now it was her turn to take the stand. Only the trial would be less about justice, and more about making a very public example out of a very formally fabulous woman. Let's rewind for a moment to Conciergerie, the dank prison on the Ile de la Cité, where Marie spent her final months. If Versailles had been all mirrors and gold trim, The conciergerie was the exact opposite. Cold stone walls, iron bars, damp floors, and the faint scent of despair. Her luxurious gowns were gone. Her hair was cut short, a pre-guillotine custom, and her daily companions were rats and jailers with no patience for royal etiquette. They no longer called her Your Majesty, just prisoner #280. The woman once known for making entranceways fashionable now had a cell so dark, even the gloom had shadows. 2 guards watched her constantly, even when she slept. One could argue it was less surveillance and more weird bedtime staring. During this time, Marie was mourning the death of her husband. Louis XVI had gone to the guillotine with minimal drama, but maximum symbolism. She was also grieving the separation from her children, especially her young son Louis Charles, who was taken from her, locked away, and indoctrinated to believe his mother was a monster. Spoiler, he didn't fare much better. But emotional devastation wasn't enough for revolutionary France. No, they needed a trial. Not to prove guilt, that was a foregone conclusion, but to perform it. Think of it less like a courtroom, and more like a very angry powdered wig stage play, where the ending was already printed on the ticket. Marie's trial began on October 14th, 1793, under the Revolutionary Tribunal, a legal institution with all the fairness of a kangaroo court, being run by kangaroos with personal grudges. Her judges were less interested in facts and more interested in theatrical outrage. Imagine Judge Judy, but with more shouting and less logic. The charges against her? They included high treason, okay, standard revolutionary fare, conspiring with foreign powers, especially her homeland of Austria, fair point, she was Austrian royalty, bankrupting France through her lavish spending. Again, let's not forget, Louis existed too. And the big finale, molesting her own son. Yes, you read that right. One of the actual charges brought forward was incestuous abuse of the young Dauphin, Louis Charles, an accusation so grotesque and unfounded that even the audience, filled with bloodthirsty revolutionaries, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marie, who had maintained stoic silence through most of the proceedings, finally stood up and responded. If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge made against a mother. It was one of her last and most human moments, and for a flicker of time, even her enemies remembered she was a mother before she was a monarch. But don't let that lull you into thinking this was going to end in mercy. The tribunal wasn't looking for truth, it was looking for a head. The trial lasted just 2 days. Witnesses were shady, evidence was flimsy. The conclusion was never in doubt. On October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was sentenced to death by guillotine. The next morning, she was given the standard outfit of the condemned, a plain white camise, no jewels, no finery, no powdered wig. Her once famous blonde hair had been cropped to expose her neck. If Versailles had been her runway, this was her anti-fashion statement. Minimalism with a sharp ending. On her final walk to the guillotine, she didn't ride in a covered carriage like Louis. She was placed in an open cart, exposed to the mocking cheers, jeers, and rotten vegetables of the Parisian crowd. But those who watched closely noted, she stood tall. At 37 years old, thinner, paler, and worn down by grief and captivity, she still carried herself with a strange, haunting dignity. In one small but unforgettable moment, she accidentally stepped on the foot of her executioner, turned to him, and whispered, "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." Even at the end, she had better manners than half the revolution. At 12:15 p.m., the blade fell. Marie Antoinette, the Austrian princess turned French queen turned reviled figurehead, was no more. The crowd cheered, the revolution moved on, and the very next week, pamphlets were already arguing whether she'd been a villain or a victim. But here's what no guillotine could cut off her myth. Whether cast as a shallow cake-peddling villain, a misunderstood scapegoat, or a tragic casualty of history, Marie Antoinette left behind a legacy so complex it's been debated for centuries. And while her head rolled away, her story kept spinning. Marie Antoinette died in 1793. Her reputation, however, has refused to stay buried. In fact, it's been reincarnated more times than a cat with a wig closet. Her head may have rolled into a basket, but her image has marched on, across revolutions, film sets, fashion runways, internet memes, and even pastries. She's gone from symbol of tyranny to tragic anti-heroine to couture-clad cultural phenomenon. In short, death was just the beginning of her rebrand. Let's start with the post-mortem PR crisis. After her execution, France didn't exactly launch a respectful mourning period. There were no candlelight vigils, no tearful retrospectives, just more pamphlets, gossip, and parodies. Revolutionaries continued to use her as the shorthand for everything wrong with monarchy. Wasteful, foreign, emotionally distant, and apparently allergic to bread-based empathy. She was painted as the ultimate villainess, Cruella de Vil, in pearls. But something curious happened in the decades that followed. The monarchy had fallen, the guillotine had cooled down, and the French people, ever the connoisseurs of irony, started to miss a little glamour. And in waltzed the ghost of Marie Antoinette. This time not as a despised queen, but as a tragic figure, a young woman chewed up and spit out by the machine of royal duty, politics, and extremely bad optics. Enter the 19th century romantics. These were the people who put drama in everything. Clouds, forests, and yes, beheaded royals. They started recasting Marie not as a cold-hearted queen, but as a delicate flower thrown to the revolutionary wolves. Memoirs from people who had served her came out, including highly sympathetic accounts. Suddenly, she was no longer Madame Deficit, but a misunderstood girl in too much tulle, who liked music, quiet gardens, and probably never asked for any of this. Fast forward to the 20th century, and Marie Antoinette made her big screen debut. Again, and again. There was the 1938 MGM film, starring Norma Shearer, which turned her into a weepy heroine. Then came Sofia Coppola's 2006 Pastel Fever Dream, where Marie is reimagined as a misunderstood teen idol, with a weakness for macarons and pop-punk, played by Kirsten Dunst and soundtracked by The Strokes. This was less historical drama and more Tumblr core Versailles. It was a Marie for the don't judge me generation. And it worked. The message? Yes, she was privileged. Yes, she wore ridiculous wigs and spent a country's GDP on one picnic. But also, she was young, trapped, and possibly doing her best in a world built entirely on show and submission. Meanwhile, the fashion world had already embraced her. Designers like Dior, Galliano, Vivienne Westwood, and Chanel all mined her closet for inspiration. Puff hair made appearances on runways. Corsets came back. Pastel dresses with yards of silk and gold embroidery were in. Vogue couldn't resist her. And why would they? Marie Antoinette was the original influencer. Centuries before Instagram, she was already curating an aesthetic. If Versailles had Wi-Fi, she would have broken the algorithm. But this iconification doesn't just reflect a fascination with frills. It says something deeper, something modern. Marie Antoinette's life is a masterclass in the power of image and propaganda. The libels, those scandalous pamphlets we met earlier, the necklace scandal, the courtroom insults, they all show how public opinion can be shaped not by truth, but by outrage. She was punished less for her crimes, real or perceived, than for what she represented. In a world starved for justice, the people aimed at a symbol, a crown, a foreign accent, a few thousand diamonds. Sound familiar? Today we live in the age of internet mobs, trial by Twitter, and tabloid takedowns. Public figures, especially women in power, are still flattened into caricatures, crucified for everything from their wardrobe to their facial expressions. Marie Antoinette may have ruled in the 1700s, but her downfall feels eerily 2020s. And yet, in death, she transcended all of it. While her body lies in the catacombs of Paris, her face is on cupcakes, book covers, Halloween costumes, and Pinterest boards. She's used to sell perfume, wine, and aesthetic rebellion. Her very name is a brand. Marie Antoinette evokes opulence, decadence, and pastel doom. Of course, there's still debate about who she really was. Was she a spoiled heiress who giggled while her people starved? A clueless teenager tossed into political chaos? A savvy operator trying to survive an impossible role? Maybe all of the above. Maybe none of them. What's certain is this. Marie Antoinette became one of history's most enduring cautionary tales. Not because she was the worst, but because her fall was the most cinematic. She had a rise, a scandal, a downfall, and a dramatic exit. And like any good tragic heroine, her story keeps being rewritten, dressed up, and reinterpreted for every new generation that needs someone to love, hate, or hashtag. So yes, she lost her head. But she gained something most queens don't get: a second act in cultural immortality. And that, perhaps, is the real cake. One we're all still eating. Before Genghis Khan was Genghis Khan, he was just Temujin, a boy born into the Mongolian steppe with a bloodline, a target on his back, and absolutely zero chill in his future. If you thought your childhood was tough because your parents didn't buy you a Nintendo, imagine being born into a world where your toys are bone knives, your neighbors are warlords, and winter can, and often does, kill your entire family. Temujin was born around 1162, in the cold grip of northeastern Mongolia, as the son of a minor tribal chieftain named Yesugei. His birth came with a side of drama. He was named after a Tatar warrior his father had just killed, which is basically the medieval version of naming your kid Revenge. It's a strong start to a life that would only get stranger. Now, Yesugei wasn't exactly the Mongol Jeff Bezos, but he was powerful enough to attract envy and enemies, lots of enemies. The political landscape of the steppes was Game of Thrones without the dragons, but with more horses and probably more biting. Power was constantly shifting, and loyalty was about as stable as a snowman in a bonfire. When Temujin was just 9 years old, his father arranged for him to marry Berte, a girl from the neighboring Ongarat tribe. Romantic? Sure, but more importantly, it was a political alliance, a move to glue together tribal loyalty with awkward preteen betrothals. Temujin was sent to live with Berte's family, but fate had other plans. Yesugei, while returning home, was poisoned by the Tatars, those same people he'd been feuding with and killing. That's what we call revenge, served with a side of arsenic. With Yesugei dead, Temujin's childhood took a hard left turn into survival mode. His family was immediately abandoned by their own tribe, the Taichiud, who decided that a widow and her children weren't worth the trouble. Suddenly, Temujin, his mother, Holun, and his siblings were homeless on the steppe, exiled with nothing but their clothes, a few ox carts, and the bitter sting of betrayal. And that's when the real education began. Forget school. Temujin's classroom was the open plains. His subjects included advanced foraging, featuring wild onions and maybe a mouse, how to not die of exposure, 101, and sibling combat tactics, starring him and his half-brother Beta, who was hogging food during a famine and found himself on the wrong end of a fatal arrow. Yes, Temujin literally killed his own brother over food. It was a harsh world, and the curve was not generous. But while others saw just another starving kid, Temujin saw something bigger. He observed how the Mongol tribes were trapped in an endless cycle of revenge, betrayal, and backstabbing. There were no rules, only winners and losers, and those roles changed weekly. So Temujin began to think differently. Instead of depending on family loyalty, clearly unreliable, he believed in merit and personal loyalty. You follow the man who earns your trust, not the guy with the fanciest tent. Around this time, he started making key alliances, small ones at first. His childhood blood brother, or Anda, Jamuka, was one such partner. For a while they were inseparable, riding together, hunting together, probably complaining about their parents together. Later they'd become enemies, but we'll get there. Temujin also proved remarkably charismatic. He wasn't just good at survival, he was good at making people believe he was worth surviving with, and he wasn't afraid to fight dirty. When he was kidnapped by the Taichiud, the very tribe that ditched his family, he escaped by charming a sympathetic jailer and fleeing under cover of darkness. 10 points for resourcefulness, 0 points for jail security. Throughout these years, Temujin's mother, Holun, was his rock. She taught him discipline, respect for women, which would echo later in his policies, and the importance of thinking long-term. In many ways, Holun was the original mastermind behind the Mongol Empire, only without the title or the war horse. By his teens, Temujin had become a scrappy war orphan with a magnetic personality, a keen sense of politics, and a deep hatred for backstabbing aristocrats. He had nothing to his name, no lands, no army, not even a real mustache yet, but he had a dangerous amount of ambition and the kind of resilience that made winter flinch. In short, this wasn't just the story of a boy growing up. This was a survival boot camp run by nature, betrayal, and brute force, and Temujin graduated with honors and a grudge. Temujin didn't become Genghis Khan by accident. He didn't win by having the biggest army or the fanciest lineage. He won because he was a tactical genius at people management, long before HR departments and LinkedIn endorsements existed. At the core of it all was one revolutionary idea for 12th century Mongolia. Loyalty should be earned, not inherited. Now let's rewind. Last we saw him, Temujin was a fatherless teenager, scraping by on wild root vegetables and pure vengeance. But poverty had taught him something. The richer chieftains never learned how to hustle for loyalty. While most Mongol nobles relied on family connections and clan loyalty, Temujin started collecting followers the way others collected sheep, one hard-won relationship at a time. His early band of supporters didn't look like much. Exiles, orphans, people cast out from the elite tribes, but they had something rare, no one else wanted them. So when Temujin offered them dignity, they gave him their swords. And then there was Jamuka. Jamuka was Temujin's childhood, and a sacred term among the Mongols, meaning sworn brother. They were thick as thieves, riding together across the steppe, probably sharing dried meat and teenage war stories. But here's the twist. While Temujin was clawing his way up from exile, Jamuka had the pedigree. He came from a powerful aristocratic lineage and had his pick of loyal clans. Their bond was genuine until it wasn't. The two reunited in their 20s. At first, they teamed up like an unstoppable nomadic boy band. Temujin with his meritocratic underdogs, Jamuka with his blue-blooded cavalry. Together, they scored a few early victories, consolidating power and giving local warlords serious anxiety. But behind the victorious celebrations, a fundamental difference was simmering. Temujin believed in rewarding ability. If you were brave, smart, and loyal, you rose up the ranks. He didn't care who your dad was. This made him extremely popular with the commoners, slaves, and disenfranchised warriors. Jamuka, on the other hand, clung to the old order, where power flowed through noble birth and tight family networks. The bromance finally imploded like a yurt in a windstorm. Temujin's vision of a united Mongol nation under equal opportunity threatened Jamuka's high society power structure. And in the Mongol world there's no let's agree to disagree. There's just your tribe or mine. In 1187 their split went from awkward to apocalyptic. Jamuka raised a force of traditionalist tribes and faced off against Temujin's rising coalition. The result? The Battle of Dalam Buljut, a bloodbath on horseback that made clear this wasn't just a rivalry. This was a full-blown ideological war. Aristocracy versus meritocracy. Old guard versus new blood. Inherited power versus earned respect. Jamuka won that first showdown, and just to make sure everyone got the message, he boiled 70 of Temujin's commanders alive. Yep, soup, with faces. This wasn't just revenge, it was psychological warfare, served hot. But Jamuka made one critical mistake. He treated his enemies like trash. Temujin, meanwhile, treated his people like partners. So even in defeat, Temujin's coalition stayed loyal. They regrouped, they recruited, and they remembered. While Jamuka tried to cling to old alliances that were beginning to fray, Temujin innovated. He began establishing rules, code of conduct, and even rankings based on battlefield merit, not ancestry. This was revolutionary in a culture obsessed with clan ties. Temujin rewarded the brave, promoted the talented, and if you betrayed him, he didn't write a sad poem. He made your entire support network disappear. By the early 1200s, Temujin's star was rising again. With each new skirmish, his forces grew more disciplined. His war strategies became the stuff of legend. Fast cavalry maneuvers, fake retreats that lured enemies into ambushes, and shockingly effective communication using flags and messengers. He was building not just an army, but a system. He also started forging key alliances beyond his scrappy band. He married his children to rival tribes, not for vanity, but to glue together peace with contractual affection. And if a tribe submitted peacefully, they were treated with respect. Resisted, not so much. Eventually, Jamuka came crawling back. In 1201, after another failed rebellion, Jamuka was betrayed by his own men and handed over to Temujin. It was a full circle moment. Temujin had every reason to turn him into warlord soup, but instead, he killed him cleanly, honoring the old bond between them. Not out of mercy, but because he knew how stories shape loyalty. The tale spread. Temujin doesn't forget a betrayal, but he doesn't forget a bond either. And in a land where power was often maintained through terror, his version of justice felt oddly fair. By the end of this phase, Temujin had done something no Mongol had done before: create a leadership model that anyone could join and want to fight for. In the wide, wind-blown steppe of Mongolia, Temujin didn't just become a leader, he became legend. This wasn't a quick rise to power. This was the slow-burn triumph of a man who, by sheer willpower and innovative thinking, transformed chaos into command. And the payoff: a new name that would echo across continents. Genghis Khan, universal ruler. It's like going from local garage band to headliner at the world's biggest imperial festival. But how did he do it? By 1206, the blood, betrayal, and battles of the previous chapters had done more than eliminate rivals. They had made Temujin inevitable through dozens of small conquests, strategic alliances, and reforms. Temujin had finally convinced, or conquered, most of the major Mongol tribes. These were groups that had spent centuries feuding over pastures, goats, and old insults, like a family reunion with arrows. Yet here they were, gathered on the banks of the Onon River for one of history's most awkward team-building events, a massive tribal council called a Kurultai. There, the decision was made. They didn't just call him a Khan, they crowned him Genghis Khan, a title that roughly translates to universal ruler. This wasn't just ceremonial fanfare, this was a seismic shift in steppe politics. Until now, no single ruler had ever united all the Mongol tribes under one banner. It was like trying to get all of Twitter to agree on something. But Temujin had done it, not with tweets, but with treaties, trust, and terrifying cavalry. His rise wasn't just military, it was legal, social, and administrative. And here's where Genghis pulled a major historical plot twist. Instead of basking in the glory and throwing massive feasts, okay, maybe a few, he got to work writing the rulebook. Enter the Asa. Part law code, part moral guideline, part how to not get executed. It wasn't written down in his lifetime, but it was enforced like gospel, and it was surprisingly modern. Some examples: religious freedom. All religions were tolerated. Genghis didn't care if you worshipped the eternal blue sky or a pile of yak bones, as long as you paid your taxes and didn't rebel. Meritocracy. Promotions in his army and government were based on skill, not aristocracy. If you were good at your job, you moved up. If you weren't, you moved underground. Permanently. Legal equality. Even aristocrats weren't above the law. If you stole a horse, expect to be punished whether you were a nobleman or a nobody. Protection of women and children. Surprisingly progressive for the 1200s, especially compared to, say, medieval Europe, where a woman's legal rights were basically don't die. And that's not all. Genghis restructured the military and civilian administration like a corporate rebrand on horseback. He organized his forces into units of 10 Arban, 100 Zun, thousands Mingan, and 10,000s Tumen, a standardized system that made logistics, taxes, and discipline easier. Every man knew his unit, and every commander knew who to answer to. It was like turning tribal warfare into a spreadsheet of doom, even more clever. He mixed clans within military units, forcing traditional enemies to fight side by side. If you wanted to hold a grudge, you'd have to do it while charging into battle together. Suddenly, loyalty shifted from family to the state, specifically to Genghis himself. It was emotional manipulation on an empire-wide scale, and he didn't stop there. He set up messenger relay stations called Yam across the empire. Think Mongol FedEx, but with more horses and fewer complaints to customer service. Messages could travel hundreds of miles a day, allowing Genghis to manage a vast territory with frightening efficiency. When the European kings were still using pigeons and praying for weather, Genghis had real-time updates on troop movements and supply lines. But perhaps the most important transformation wasn't organizational, it was cultural. Genghis elevated the idea of the Mongol nation above individual clans. He crafted a new identity for his people, one where loyalty wasn't just to your bloodline, but to the empire itself. You weren't just from the Merkits or the Taichiad, you were Mongol, and your Khan was Genghis. And that's what made his new title so powerful. Genghis Khan wasn't just a fancy name, it was a mission statement, a declaration that his rule didn't stop at Mongolia's mountains or rivers, but extended wherever horses could ride. So while Europe was still squabbling over who got which crown and which pope was the real one, Genghis Khan had taken a loose web of nomads and turned them into a well-oiled, terrifying machine of conquest, guided by rules stricter than a suburban HOA but enforced with the speed of a mounted archer. Genghis Khan, destroyer of cities, scourge of empires, and unexpectedly, women's rights reformer. You wouldn't think the guy famous for his sky-high body count and habit of riding into town like a thunderstorm, with a personal vendetta, would also have a more progressive gender policy than 13th century Europe. But that's exactly what happened. While knights in Europe were locking up their wives in stone towers and debating whether women had souls, Genghis Khan was laying down laws that, while not exactly modern, were shockingly ahead of their time. Let's start with the Yasa, his secretive and likely evolving code of law. Among its many stipulations about loyalty, military order, and crime, it also had explicit provisions protecting women. That's right, Genghis the Terrible was also Genghis the You'd Better Ask Her First. For starters, marriage couldn't be forced without the woman's consent. In a world where daughters were bartered like livestock in exchange for political favors, that was radical. Women could refuse a proposal, and marriages had to be mutually agreed upon, which is basically medieval Mongol for swipe right or get lost. Then there were the strict penalties for adultery, but not just aimed at women. The Yasar didn't take sides. Both participants in an adulterous affair could be punished severely. While European laws might stone the woman and slap the man on the wrist, Genghis took the equality under the law thing seriously. Disturbingly so, since equality sometimes came via execution. Still, the intent mattered. Women weren't seen as property. They were seen as people with agency, even if the consequences of that agency were sometimes sharp and pointy. Divorce, absolutely allowed, and not just for men. Women could initiate it, and once divorced, they retained rights to property and children. In many Mongol communities, women also inherited property outright. Compare that to England, where married women were legally fused with their husbands like a medieval Wi-Fi connection. Slow, unstable, and completely under the man's control. Now let's talk about Bertie, Genghis Khan's first and primary wife. Bertie wasn't just a romantic partner. She was a political operator, a counselor, and arguably the woman who secured his early power. After being kidnapped by rival tribes early in their marriage, Temujin waged a small war to get her back, a love story by Mongol standards. Once returned, she remained his chief consort, even as he married others for political alliances. And here's the twist. Bertie ruled the camp when Genghis was off conquering half the planet. She handled logistics, supplies, and oversaw political decisions. Think COO of the Mongol Empire. And then there were the daughters. Genghis didn't just marry them off like decorative trophies. He strategically placed them in charge of entire regions. When he conquered new lands, especially in Central Asia and parts of China, he often appointed his daughters as governors. One daughter, Alakai Beki, ruled the Ongud people in China and led military forces. Another, Ultani, was so renowned for defending her camp from a raider that she earned a personal commendation from her father. And let's be real, getting a compliment from Genghis was rarer than a peaceful Tuesday in Kolwezin. These women weren't token figures. They controlled trade routes, oversaw tax systems, and maintained order in the name of the Khan. And they were chosen, not because they were his offspring, but because they were proven, capable leaders. This system of empowering women wasn't just a family quirk, it was deeply woven into Mongol culture. Mongol women could ride, hunt, and fight. They ran the household economy, negotiated alliances, and even managed herds and battle logistics, while the men were away campaigning. Their voices mattered, and their work was critical to the survival of the entire nomadic structure. In fact, Mongol women often had more practical authority than many queens in feudal Europe, who were mostly expected to birth heirs and look pious, while slowly dying of medieval medicine. Now, don't get us wrong, this wasn't feminist utopia on horseback. Genghis still practiced polygyny, multiple wives, and slavery was part of the system. Women still lived in a patriarchal structure, and there were strict codes of behavior. But within that system, Mongol women had far more autonomy, rights, and respect than their contemporaries in Christian Europe or Islamic caliphates. It was a step-forward society, you might say. And even after Genghis's death, the influence of Mongol women continued. Several of his descendant queens and khatoons, empresses, ruled independently, advised khans, and commanded armies. They didn't just sit pretty, they kept the empire from collapsing while the men were off squabbling or dying in battles. So yes, Genghis Khan, scourge of cities, ruiner of dynasties, and uninvited guest at 1,000 court banquets, was also weirdly pro-women's rights. Not because he was soft, but because he understood something timeless. Empire building requires every ounce of talent, no matter what gender it comes in. Before Netflix had seasons, the Mongol conquest of China was its own long-running blood-soaked saga. And Genghis Khan, he wasn't just binge-watching dynasties fall, he was writing the scripts, directing the carnage, and occasionally starring as the unexpected plot twist. In this chapter, we head to China, where the Great Wall met its match in a determined horseman with absolutely no respect for architectural boundaries. Let's rewind to the early 1200s. China wasn't a unified state. Instead, it was more like a dramatic family reunion with too many uncles and far too many armies. The Jin dynasty ruled the north, holding power with strict hierarchy and thick city walls, while the Song dynasty held the south, hoping the Mongols never figured out boats. Genghis focused first on the Jin, not just because they were close, but because they made the mistake of insulting his messengers. And if there's one rule in the Mongol rulebook, it's this: don't mess with the messengers. It's the fastest way to go from diplomatic inquiry to flaming ruin. In 1211, Genghis gathered his horsemen, sharpened his arrows, and looked at the Great Wall the way a cat looks at a closed door, with determination and just enough arrogance to make it your problem. Now the Great Wall was supposed to be the ultimate no trespassing sign, but Genghis, ever the innovator, treated it like a slightly inconvenient fence. Mongol scouts found unmanned stretches, bribed frontier guards, and even exploited weather conditions to bypass or break through. While emperors in Beijing congratulated themselves on ancient masonry, the Mongols just rode around the edges, set fire to the gate, and let themselves in. Once inside, the real fun began. If your idea of fun involves psychological warfare, flaming arrows, and cities surrendering before they even heard hoofbeats, Genghis knew how to weaponize fear. His siege strategy was a masterclass in multitasking doom. Cities were surrounded by mobile cavalry units that moved like water, appearing, vanishing, and reappearing where you least expected. The Mongols didn't just attack walls, they attacked mines. They'd release captives to spread tales of slaughter, light up nighttime skies with firebombs, and blast city walls with early forms of gunpowder weapons adopted from Chinese sources. Yes, Genghis might have been a horseman of the apocalypse, but he was also an attentive student of science. As cities fell, the Mongols didn't just loot gold and grain, they recruited engineers, scribes, and scholars, especially the ones who knew how to make things go boom. Chinese experts were folded into the war machine, offering everything from siege tower blueprints to gunpowder chemistry. One unfortunate Chinese engineer once said, "Sure, I'll help build a catapult," and 2 weeks later, found himself inventing new ways to launch boulders at his own hometown. That's how Genghis operated. Not just with force, but with absorbed brilliance. Unlike many conquerors, he didn't burn every library to the ground. If you were smart, useful, or spoke multiple languages, congratulations, you just got hired by the empire. If you were a noble clinging to tradition and resistant to change, well, let's just say your house was going to need new walls. One of the most brutal highlights of this campaign was the siege of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing. After the Jin emperor fled like a cartoon villain in the third act, the Mongols laid siege for nearly a year. Citizens starved, disease spread, and the Mongols, growing increasingly impatient, began hurling rotting corpses over the walls with trebuchets, just to send a message. And that message was, "We're bored, and you're next." When Zhongdu finally fell, it was set ablaze in spectacular Mongol fashion, with the survivors either absorbed, enslaved, or erased. And yet, despite the carnage, this wasn't just about slaughter. Genghis wasn't driven by bloodlust. He was driven by control. After the conquest, he installed a structured administration, left Chinese officials in place, the cooperative ones, and ensured taxes were collected, trade resumed, and roads stayed safe. He was brutal, yes, but he also built the kind of stability that made merchants sigh in relief and bandits curse the sky. Perhaps the most ironic twist? Genghis didn't want to destroy China. he wanted to use. The Mongols adopted paper currency, Chinese agricultural techniques, postal relay stations, and perhaps most critically, bureaucracy. Yes, the guy who could barely read created an administration that would become the backbone of Mongol rule, from the Pacific to the Caspian. So the next time someone praises the Great Wall, remind them, Genghis Khan didn't knock it down, he outsmarted it. You know what terrifies a kingdom more than a horde of screaming horsemen? A horde of screaming horsemen that somehow show up weeks earlier than anyone thought possible. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer with swords and siege engines, he conquered with logistics. And while that may not sound sexy, consider this, he built the 13th century version of Amazon Prime, except it was faster, came with arrows, and didn't leave your package on the neighbor's doorstep. Let's talk about the real MVP of the Mongol Empire, the YAM system. Imagine a network of thousands of relay stations stretching from Mongolia to Hungary, each stocked with fresh horses, food, and occasionally suspiciously tired couriers, muttering about bandits in the last province. This wasn't just a mail system, it was a strategic marvel, a logistical lifeline, and the Mongols' not-so-secret weapon. The word yam literally means checkpoint, or post. Every 25 to 30 miles, roughly the distance a horse could gallop before pulling a muscle, there was a way station. Riders carrying official messages would arrive, swap out their exhausted mount for a fresh one, and keep going without even pausing for a cup of fermented mare's milk. This allowed messages to travel at nearly 200 miles a day, which was blistering speed for a medieval empire where most nations thought urgent delivery meant maybe before your next monarch died. Now add in paisas, little tablet-sized medallions that served as imperial passports. Issued by Genghis himself, they were the VIP backstage pass of the empire. If you had one, it meant you were traveling on official business, and woe unto any poor soul who dared to delay you. Local governors were required to provide food, shelter, horses, and sometimes even soldiers to anyone flashing one of these shiny badges. The result? A highly mobile, state-backed highway of information, capable of outpacing enemies, spreading orders, and delivering terrifying efficiency. And this wasn't just for wartime memos. The YAM system was also used for trade, taxation, census-taking, and diplomatic correspondence. Genghis knew that communication was power, and he wielded it like a saber. While European kings were still sending scrolls by unreliable monks on foot, Genghis had a continent-wide express pony network that made the Pony Express look like a school play. But how did he know where to send his horsemen in the first place? Enter the Mongol spy network, possibly the most underrated intelligence operation in world history. Before he ever attacked a city, Genghis sent spies disguised as merchants, diplomats, or monks to scope things out. They gathered data on everything: population size, walls, guard schedules, food supplies, and the psychological state of the locals. Some even posed as refugees to gain sympathy and entrance to cities. Once the intel was in, it was carefully catalogued. Genghis had a particular love for maps and strategic overviews, and used to plan campaigns with surgical precision. He didn't just overwhelm enemies with brute force, he pre-knew their weaknesses, hit where it hurt, and pulled off coordinated strikes over hundreds of miles, like a military maestro on horseback. And speaking of miles, have we mentioned the Mongol horse? Because the Mongols didn't just love their horses, they were basically one biological organism with them. Each warrior traveled with 3 to 5 spare mounts, and they'd switch between them mid-campaign like your grandma, switching from sandals to orthopedic boots. The horses were small, sturdy, fast, and could survive on snow, grass, or whatever they found in the dirt. They rarely needed water, barely ever got lame, and could gallop for days. Basically, they were the Toyota Hilux of medieval war ponies. The logistics didn't stop with just horses and highways. The Mongols also developed supply chains for food, weapons, and fodder. During campaigns, they didn't wait for hunger to kick in. They sent advance parties to gather resources, construct bridges, and prepare river crossings. Think medieval version of a support van with everything pre-packed. Even the steppe diet played a role. Fermented mare's milk, erag, dried meat, and hard cheese were portable, calorie-dense, and had the shelf life of an immortal squirrel. And in true Mongol fashion, this efficiency was weaponized. They could launch surprise invasions from seemingly impossible distances, move entire armies quicker than defenders could react, and coordinated attacks across separate fronts by relying on their communication speed. During the invasion of Khwarezmia, different Mongol divisions, separated by thousands of miles of desert, moved in tandem, striking cities like synchronized doom on horseback. Genghis didn't need to be in 5 places at once. His couriers were. All of this added up to one terrifying realization for the rest of the world. You didn't know when the Mongols were coming, but when they arrived, it was already too late. Imagine sending someone a gift basket and getting a flaming bag of insults in return. That's basically what happened when Genghis Khan decided to say hello to the Khwarezmian Empire, and what followed was the historical equivalent of flipping a Monopoly board and setting the table on fire. It all started innocently enough by Mongol standards. Around 1218, Genghis Khan was at the peak of his power in Central Asia. He had tamed the tribes, smashed the Chinese Jin dynasty, and was ready to open up new channels of trade. So in a rare moment of diplomacy, he sent a caravan of Muslim merchants and envoys to the wealthy Khwarezmian city of Otrar, with spices, fabrics, and the Mongol version of a LinkedIn request. The Shah of Khwarezm, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, however, had less chill than an overheated yak. He suspected the caravan was filled with spies. Spoiler, it wasn't. So like a masterclass in how to make bad decisions, he arrested the traders, seized the goods, and executed everyone. Now Genghis wasn't happy, but he gave the Shah a second chance, because even ruthless conquerors know how to count to 2. He sent 3 official diplomats to protest the execution. One was murdered, and the other 2 had their beards burned off, which in 13th century diplomatic terms is the equivalent of punching someone's mom and setting their flag on fire. So Genghis responded with subtlety, tact, and calm negotiation. Just kidding. He launched a full-scale invasion with over 200,000 troops, more horses than grains of rice in a pilgrim's lunch, and a personal grudge so deep you could drown in it. His goal wasn't conquest, it was total annihilation. First up, Bukhara. Genghis didn't just sack it. He gave a TED talk from the local mosque about divine punishment, and then torched the place. He spared artisans and scholars, because even genocidal emperors like skilled labor, but everyone else. Let's just say the population of Bukhara got dramatically easier to count. Then came Samarkand, the crown jewel of the Khwarezmian Empire. The city had tall walls, elite guards, and a belief that it could resist. It fell in a week. Genghis was so efficient he made spreadsheets look messy. He used siege engineers from China, terror tactics, and straight-up psychological warfare. People surrendered just from hearing the Mongols were nearby. Kind of like how people close their blinds when they see Jehovah's Witnesses approaching. Except these visitors brought catapults and rivers of blood. But the most poetic vengeance came at Nishapur, after one of Genghis's sons-in-law was killed in a rebellion. The Khan allegedly let his daughter order the punishment. Her request: level the city and pile the skulls high. Mongol historians claim the death toll was hundreds of thousands. Other sources are vague, but regardless of the math, one thing's clear: Genghis didn't do forgiveness. He did statements, in blood. The entire campaign wasn't just about revenge, it was a masterclass in Mongol shock and awe tactics. Genghis employed fake retreats to lure troops out, sent advance parties to sow confusion, and always kept the pressure on multiple fronts. While the Shah tried to regroup, Genghis sent sub-commanders like Subutai and Jabi to pursue him across mountains, rivers, and bad decisions. Eventually, the Shah died of illness while fleeing, broken, disgraced, and having learned the hard way that insulting Genghis Khan is like slapping a bear and then trying to outrun a lightning bolt. But the cherry on this violent Sunday? Genghis didn't stop with the Shah's death. He hunted down the Shah's son, destroyed city after city, and made sure that Khwarezm was not just conquered, but utterly erased from the map. Entire irrigation systems were destroyed, farmland was salted, and the population either killed or scattered. In the aftermath, messages spread across the Islamic world and beyond. Don't mess with the Mongols. Submit and prosper. Resist, and well, you won't be doing much after that. But here's where the twist comes in. Even amid the horror, Genghis still kept scribes documenting everything. He sent back detailed battle reports, issued laws about loot distribution, and maintained his courier network to ensure that the massacre ran on time. In a gruesome way, it was organized chaos, bureaucracy soaked in blood. The Kubwemian campaign proved one thing. Genghis Khan wasn't just a conqueror, he was a force of nature, weaponized by betrayal, driven by vengeance, and executed with almost clinical precision. It might sound strange that Genghis Khan, the guy who once declared, "The greatest joy is to crush your enemies and hear the lamentations of their women," also ran what might be the most religiously tolerant empire of the Middle Ages. But while he was busy turning cities into charcoal and enemies into mulch, Genghis also quietly implemented one of the most inclusive spiritual policies in human history. Just don't confuse tolerance with kindness. This was less about warm hugs and more about strategic genius. Let's set the stage. By the time Genghis's empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, it had absorbed an astonishing mosaic of faiths: Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Taoists, Zoroastrians, Confucians, animists, shamans, and even a few Nestorians who are still arguing with regular Christians about the nature of Jesus to this day. Instead of choosing one religion and trying to shove it down everyone's throat, the classic move of nearly every empire before him, Genghis said something like, "Worship whoever you want, just don't cause trouble, and pay your taxes." That's not to say Genghis was indifferent to religion. In fact, he believed deeply in the great blue sky, a Mongol concept of divine fate, or eternal heaven, Tengrism. But unlike European kings who claimed God personally endorsed their every bad haircut, Genghis saw his own success as a sign from the heavens, not a divine license to enforce a singular truth. He respected religion as a force of unity, legitimacy, and even supernatural insurance. So, what did religious freedom look like under the Mongols? Clergy of all faiths were tax-exempt. That's right. Buddhist monks, Christian priests, Muslim imams, all got a divine pass when it came to paying up. In some cases, they were even exempt from military service and could ride free through the empire, kind of like 13th century Uber passengers blessed by Buddha. This tax break wasn't just a show of generosity, it was a policy move to win hearts, especially among conquered peoples who'd seen other empires torch their temples and deport their clerics. In fact, when Genghis conquered cities, his standard operating procedure was kill the people who resisted, spare the craftsmen and religious leaders, rebuild the temples, and then ask the monks for divine favor. There are records of Genghis personally consulting Buddhist monks, inviting Taoist sages to court, and sponsoring debates between different religions. Yes, he basically ran medieval TED Talks with theologians trying to outdo each other while drinking fermented mare's milk. A particularly charming moment came when a Taoist monk, Chu Chuji, was invited to the Mongol court. Genghis listened to him speak at length about spiritual purity and long life, then basically shrugged and asked, "Cool, so how do I live forever?" Chu Chuji gave him diet and exercise tips. Genghis still died eventually, but the fact that he was willing to sit and talk philosophy with a peaceful hermit says a lot about the man who burned cities yet held prayer in high esteem. This open-door policy made the Mongol Empire shockingly stable, considering how massive and diverse it was. When your ruler isn't trying to convert you or kill you for your beliefs, you tend to stay a bit more chill. Genghis' policy ensured that people from every background could see themselves in the empire. It wasn't about assimilation, it was about cooperation. You keep your god, I keep my rule, and we both stay alive. Of course, there was a catch. Religious freedom came with one giant asterisk. You were free to worship as long as you didn't challenge Genghis's authority, interfere with the state, or try to convert the Khan himself. That was a surefire way to meet the afterlife, regardless of which god you were dialing up. The moment your beliefs translated into civil disobedience, out came the cavalry. And don't think religious leaders got away with tax fraud either. In one famous case, a group of Buddhist monks tried to exploit their exemption status by running profitable trade networks. Not very monk-like. Genghis reportedly fined them, then exempted them again. He wasn't naive. He just believed that religious institutions functioned best when they were respected and tightly watched. One overlooked side effect of this policy was the exchange of knowledge. Because temples, churches, and mosques weren't being destroyed every other Tuesday, the Mongols unintentionally protected libraries, preserved texts, and kept scientific ideas flowing across Asia and Europe. Want to know how algebra, astronomy, and medicine survived long enough to reach the Renaissance? you can partly thank the guy who once executed a city for not surrendering fast enough. So yes, Genghis Khan was brutal, but when it came to belief, tolerance and long-term strategy, he was also uncannily modern. He realized early what many would take centuries to figure out. If you give people the freedom to pray, they're less likely to rebel. And if you give their priests a tax break, well, now they're your publicists. By the time Genghis Khan reached the twilight of his life, he had become a force of nature more than a man, a living storm that reshaped Asia with hoofbeats and fire. He'd built the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen, and everyone from Persian poets to terrified European monks had taken notice. So when death finally came for the great Khan, it wasn't just the end of a man, it was the beginning of a ripple effect that would shake the world for centuries, and still manage to be wrapped in layers of mystery, blood oaths, and at least one suspiciously deadly horse. In 1227, Genghis Khan was in his mid-60s, old for a steppe warlord who spent his life chasing battles, drinking fermented milk, and managing an empire larger than the moon's ego. He was deep in a campaign against the Western Jabal dynasty in northern China, punishing them for daring to break an alliance. Midway through the siege, something happened, and here's the thing, no one knows what. Seriously, we're talking about one of history's most documented conquerors, and yet, his death is the biggest cold case on the steppe. Some sources say he fell off his horse and suffered internal injuries, which feels ironic, considering the man practically invented horseback warfare. Others claim he died of battle wounds. A few whisper about assassination by a captive ex-princess, possibly via a concealed weapon, or, depending on who you ask, even extreme romantic resistance. There's also the classic fallback explanation: illness, plague, fever, infection, you name it. But given the cloak and dagger secrecy surrounding his final days, it's like trying to find Waldo when Waldo burned the map and killed the cartographer. When a man like Genghis Khan dies, you don't just throw him in a box and call it a day. His funeral had to be legendary, terrifying, and because it's Genghis, deeply weird. According to Mongol law, his body was returned to Mongolia under a veil of absolute secrecy. The escort transporting him supposedly killed everyone they encountered along the way to keep the route hidden. Once the Khan was buried, most likely in the Khemti Mountains, the soldiers then killed each other, or were executed by a follow-up group, just to really seal the lid on the mystery. Some versions even claim that 1,000 horses were ridden over the burial site to flatten the land and erase any trace of the grave. So yes, in death as in life, Genghis was extra. No tomb, no pyramid, no giant statue, just eternal anonymity and a trail of bodies to mark the silence. Modern archaeologists have used satellite imaging, drones, and even sniffer bees, yes bees, to try and find the lost tomb. So far, no dice. Genghis Khan may be history's most prolific ghostwriter. Literally, before his death, Genghis wisely did what many powerful rulers fail to do: prepare for the chaos he knew was coming. He summoned his sons and advisors, and laid out a plan to divide the empire among his children. Think of it as a medieval family estate plan, except instead of squabbling over jewelry and beachfront property, they were divvying up continents. Ogedei, the third son, was named the Great Khan and inherited the title of supreme ruler. A Chagatai got Central Asia and the realm around modern Uzbekistan. Tului, the youngest, held Mongolia proper and acted as a kind of imperial steward. Jochi, the eldest, and possibly illegitimate, as he was born after Berte's abduction, had already died, but his descendants would go on to rule the Golden Horde, Russia's future headache. This division led to 4 major Mongol Khanates after Genghis's death: the Yuan dynasty in China, Kublai Khan's Gig, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the northwest, though technically under the authority of the Great Khan in Karakoram, and later Beijing. These branches quickly became semi-independent dynasties, each with their own flavor of conquest, diplomacy, and sibling rivalry. Even in death, Genghis's influence was not buried with him. His empire didn't just collapse into a puff of barbarian dust, it transformed Eurasia. The Mongol conquests opened the Silk Road in unprecedented ways, leading to trade between Europe and Asia at levels never seen before, transmitted technology, culture, and disease across vast distances. Yes, the Black Death, likely hitched a ride on Mongol trade routes. Thanks, Genghis. Spread the idea of meritocracy, religious tolerance, and postal networks. Sparked European exploration. Without the Mongols, Marco Polo might have just stayed home with his dad's spice cabinet. And centuries later, rulers from Napoleon to Stalin admired the sheer audacity of a man who came from nothing, united the steppe, and redrew the world, using only horses, arrows, and a charisma made of steel. To this day, Genghis Khan's grave remains undiscovered. His descendants ruled empires. His bloodline allegedly survives in 0.5% of men on Earth, and his legacy is still debated. Was he a genocidal monster, or a brilliant state builder, a brutal warlord, or a visionary reformer? Maybe the real answer is yes. But one thing is certain, Genghis Khan died as he lived in motion, in mystery, and miles ahead of the rest of the world. So you've survived the arrows, the conquests, the fermented mare's milk, and the mysterious death. Genghis Khan, the man who rose from a starving child on the steppes to the thunderclap of history, is long gone. But he's not really gone, because like glitter at a craft fair, Genghis is everywhere. Not just in books, statues, or national myths. No, quite literally, he may be in you. And no, that's not just poetic. It's genetic. In 2003, a group of geneticists dropped a scientific mic on the world when they published a study that rocked both the scientific and historical communities. They found that around 0.5% of the world's male population, about 16 million men, share a nearly identical Y chromosome, all tracing back to the same source in roughly the 13th century Mongolian region. Their conclusion? It likely originated with Genghis Khan, or one of his close male relatives. Why? Because this was a man who didn't just conquer territories. He spread his legacy the old-fashioned way, heavily and frequently. Genghis had multiple wives, concubines, and the kind of authority that let him play matchmaker and match-winner on a grand scale. His sons and grandsons were similarly prolific. When you control an empire stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe, paternity is practically policy. So, congratulations. If your family tree has roots in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, or parts of the Middle East, you might just be a Khanlet, a distant, mildly terrifying piece of history. In modern-day Mongolia, Genghis Khan, or Chinggis Khan, as he's known locally, is nothing short of a national deity, with marketing potential. He's on their money, their vodka bottles, their airport name, and their official state-honoring committee of really important people, probably. During Soviet rule, talking about Genghis was actually discouraged, because the Soviets were not fans of nationalist pride that didn't come from Lenin's mustache. But since the 1990s, he's had a roaring comeback. Statues of him on horseback now tower over landscapes. His face beams proudly from textbooks. His image is everywhere from government halls to gift shops to Mongolia. He is not a barbarian. He's the founder, the father, the ultimate made in Mongolia success story. He didn't just build an empire. He built a legacy of cultural identity, language and pride that the Mongolian people still draw strength from today. Now cross the border into China, and things get complicated. On one hand, the Chinese are happy to celebrate Genghis's Yuan dynasty, established by his grandson Kublai Khan. It's recognized as a legitimate Chinese dynasty, and Chinese history books now treat it as part of the great tapestry of Chinese civilization, albeit the patch that came with a lot of flaming arrows. On the other hand, Genghis was, a foreign invader who torched cities and slaughtered populations. So in regions like Xi'an or Beijing, his name still evokes terror, resentment, and the memory of cultural trauma. Chinese schoolchildren might study him, but they're not exactly dressing up as him for Halloween. In short, he's respected, but not invited to the family reunion. Western history has long struggled to put Genghis Khan in a neat little box. In the 18th and 19th centuries, he was often portrayed as the ultimate savage, the blood-soaked scourge of civilization, a cautionary tale with a horse. European historians, seeing themselves as the height of reason and refinement, used Genghis as a dark mirror of what they feared, raw power without a powdered wig. But by the late 20th and 21st centuries, the narrative began to shift. Scholars began to see Genghis not as a mindless brute, but as a strategic genius, a master organizer and surprise. an early champion of religious freedom, literacy, and legal reform. Books like Genghis Khan and The Making of the Modern World reframed him as a misunderstood architect of globalization. It turns out that behind the burning cities were postal systems, diplomatic networks, and an empire that enabled cultural exchange centuries before the Enlightenment ever lit a candle. Today he's a paradox, part Attila, part Abraham Lincoln. So how does one man end up as a saint, villain, and ancestor all at once? Because history doesn't remember you based on your facts. It remembers you based on who writes the story and what they need from it. Genghis Khan has been used as a cautionary tale, a source of national pride, a meme, a monument, and even an action figure. In truth, his legacy says less about Genghis himself and more about our own obsession with power, fear, control, and glory. He's the ultimate Rorschach test of world history, a man of contradictions who ruled by terror yet established law, who destroyed cities yet built civilizations, who took everything and yet left behind a myth big enough to still fill textbooks and TikToks. So yes, he lost his empire, he lost his life, but what he never lost was the spotlight. And as long as there are descendants to trace, borders to redraw, and debates to be had, Genghis Khan will never really ride off into the sunset.